Hello everyone, welcome to the channel. Before we begin today's attack report, I want to ask you to subscribe to the channel. Your subscription is very important to us, so please subscribe. Also, write now in the comments which city you're watching from. We'd love to know. All of this because the sun was dipping below the tree line as we pulled into the secluded campsite nestled deep in the Oregon wilderness. I couldn't shake the feeling we were being watched as I stepped out of the car, stretching my legs after the long drive. The forest seemed to press in around us, ancient pines towering overhead, their branches swaying gently in the cool evening breeze. "We made it," my best friend Sarah exclaimed, her voice tinged with excitement and relief. "I thought we'd never find this place." I forced a smile, trying to shake off my unease. "Yeah, it's pretty remote. Perfect for getting away from it all, right?" Our other friends, Mike and Jason, were already unloading gear from the trunk. The crunch of gravel under their feet seemed unnaturally loud in the stillness of the forest. "Hey, Megan," Mike called out, tossing me my backpack. "You okay? You look a little pale." I caught the bag, nearly stumbling under its weight. "I'm fine," I lied, not wanting to dampen their enthusiasm. "Just tired from the drive, I guess." As we set up our tents, I couldn't help but feel like the trees were closing in around us. Their shadows stretched long and dark across the clearing, and every rustle of leaves made me jump. I tried to focus on the task at hand, driving tent stakes into the soft earth and unrolling sleeping bags. "Did you guys hear that?" Jason asked suddenly, pausing in the middle of unpacking the cooler. We all froze, listening intently. For a moment, there was nothing but the whisper of wind through the trees. Then faintly I heard it, a low rumbling sound that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. Sarah laughed nervously. "Probably just someone's stomach. We should get dinner started." As the others busied themselves with building a fire and preparing our meal, I found myself drawn to the edge of the campsite. The forest beyond our little clearing was a wall of darkness, the spaces between the trees pitch black and impenetrable. I squinted, trying to make out shapes in the gloom, but saw nothing. "Earth to Megan." Sarah's voice snapped me back to reality. She was holding out a paper plate loaded with hot dogs and potato chips. "Food's ready. Come join us by the fire." I took the plate with a murmured thanks and settled onto a log around the campfire. The flames cast flickering shadows across my friends' faces, making them look unfamiliar and strange for brief moments. "So," Mike said around a mouthful of food, "who wants to tell the first ghost story?" Jason groaned. "Really, man? We just got here. Let's save the scares for tomorrow night." "Aw, come on," Mike protested. "It's tradition. We can't have a proper camping trip without at least one spooky tale." I stared into the fire, only half listening to their banter. The flames danced hypnotically, and for a split second, I thought I saw a pair of gleaming eyes watching us from the darkness beyond. I blinked and they were gone. "Megan?" Sarah's concerned voice pulled me back. "You've barely touched your food. Are you sure you're okay?" I forced myself to take a bite of my now cold hot dog. "Yeah, sorry. Just taking it all in, I guess. It's so different out here compared to the city." "That's the whole point," Mike exclaimed. "No cell service, no internet, just us and nature. It's going to be an awesome weekend." As the night wore on, we swapped stories and roasted marshmallows. The fire burned low, and one by one my friends started yawning and heading to their tents. Soon, it was just Sarah and me left by the glowing embers. "You've been quiet all night," she said softly. "What's really going on, Meg?" I sighed, unsure how to explain the dread that had been building in my chest since we arrived. "I don't know. Something just feels off, like we're not supposed to be here." Sarah squeezed my hand. "It's probably just being out of your comfort zone. Remember how freaked out you were on our first camping trip in high school? By tomorrow, you'll be loving it." I nodded, not entirely convinced. "You're probably right. I should try to get some sleep." We doused the remaining embers and headed to our respective tents. As I zipped up the entrance, I heard a low, guttural growl that made my blood run cold. It was unlike anything I'd ever heard before. Not quite animal, not quite human. "Did you hear that?" I called out, my voice shaking. "Hear what?" Jason's sleepy voice replied from the next tent over. That sound like a growl or something." There was a rustling as Jason poked his head out of his tent. "I didn't hear anything, Megan. Probably just the wind or some animal in the distance. Try to get some sleep, okay?" I nodded even though he couldn't see me in the darkness. "Yeah, okay. Good night." I crawled into my sleeping bag, my heart still racing. As I lay there straining my ears for any unusual sounds, the forest seemed to come alive around me. Every creak of a branch, every rustle of leaves sounded amplified in the stillness of the night. Hours passed, and sleep eluded me. The air in the tent grew stuffy, and I found myself gasping for breath. Needing some fresh air, I unzipped the tent as quietly as possible and stepped outside. The clearing was bathed in pale moonlight, casting everything in an eerie, silvery glow. The trees at the edge of our campsite looked like looming sentinels, their branches reaching out like gnarled fingers. A light mist had settled over the ground, swirling around my ankles as I moved. I took a deep breath, trying to calm my nerves. The cool night air felt good on my skin, and for a moment I started to relax. Then I heard it again, that same low, rumbling growl, closer this time. My eyes darted around the campsite, searching for the source of the sound. The shadows between the trees seemed to shift and move, playing tricks on my eyes. Was that a massive shape moving in the darkness, or just my imagination? A twig snapped somewhere in the forest, the sound like a gunshot in the silence. I jumped, my heart pounding so hard I thought it might burst from my chest. "Hello?" I called out, my voice barely above a whisper. "Is someone there?" No response came, but I could feel eyes on me, watching from the darkness. The hair on the back of my neck stood up, and every instinct screamed at me to run, to wake the others, to get out of this forest as fast as possible. But I was rooted to the spot, unable to move as the shadows at the edge of the clearing seemed to coalesce into a massive, hulking shape. For a brief, terrifying moment, I caught a glimpse of gleaming eyes and matted fur before the figure melted back into the darkness. I stumbled backward, nearly tripping over a tent stake in my haste to get back to the safety of my tent. Once inside, I zipped it up with trembling hands and burrowed deep into my sleeping bag, trying to convince myself that what I'd seen was just a trick of the light, a product of my overactive imagination. But as I lay there, wide awake and heart racing, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was out there in the forest. Something big, something dangerous. And it was watching us, waiting for the right moment to strike. Sleep finally claimed me in the early hours of the morning, but my dreams were filled with shadowy figures and guttural growls. I knew that when dawn broke I'd have to tell the others what I'd seen. But would they believe me? Or would they dismiss it as nothing more than campfire jitters? As consciousness slowly returned, I became aware of rustling outside the tent. My friends were probably up starting breakfast, but the events of the night came rushing back and a new wave of fear washed over me. What if it wasn't my friends making those sounds? What if the thing I'd seen was still out there circling our campsite? With a deep breath, I steeled myself to unzip the tent and face whatever the new day might bring. Little did I know, the true horror of our camping trip was only just beginning. I woke to the sound of rustling outside, my heart pounding as I realized it was too big to be a raccoon. The events of the night before came rushing back, and I lay frozen in my sleeping bag, straining my ears to catch any other sounds. The rustling continued, accompanied by heavy footfalls and what sounded like tearing fabric. "Guys," I called out weakly, hoping it was just one of my friends moving around the campsite. No one answered. Summoning my courage, I slowly unzipped my tent and peeked outside. The early morning light cast long shadows across the clearing and a thin mist hung in the air. What I saw made my blood run cold. Our food cache, which we had carefully hung from a tree branch the night before, was torn apart. Food wrappers and containers were strewn across the ground, and the sturdy rope we'd used lay in shredded pieces. But it was the footprints surrounding the destruction that truly terrified me. They were massive, easily twice the size of a human foot, with clear impressions of toes and a shape that was unmistakably primate-like. My mind raced, trying to rationalize what I was seeing, but I knew deep down that these weren't bear tracks or any other animal I was familiar with. "Oh my God," I whispered, backing away slowly. "Megan? What's wrong?" Sarah's voice came from behind me, making me jump. I turned to see her emerging from her tent, rubbing sleep from her eyes. "Sarah, look," I said, pointing at the devastation. Her eyes widened as she took in the scene. What the hell happened? By now, Mike and Jason had also woken up and joined us. We stood in a tight circle, surveying the damage with a mixture of confusion and fear. "It must have been a bear," Mike said, but his voice lacked conviction. I shook my head. "Those aren't bear tracks, Mike. Look at them." We all stared at the footprints, an uneasy silence falling over the group. "Maybe we should pack up and leave," Sarah suggested, her voice trembling slightly. Jason scoffed. "Come on, guys. We can't let one animal sighting ruin our whole trip. We'll just be more careful with our food from now on." As they debated whether to stay or go, I found myself drawn to the edge of the clearing. The forest seemed different in the daylight, less menacing but no less mysterious. I scanned the tree line, half expecting to see the hulking shape from last night watching us. Suddenly, I realized something was off. The forest had fallen eerily silent. No birdsong, no chattering squirrels, not even the buzz of insects. It was as if the entire woodland had collectively held its breath. "Guys," I said, my voice barely above a whisper, "listen." They fell quiet, and the unnatural silence of the forest pressed in around us. "Where are all the animals?" Sarah asked, her eyes darting nervously from tree to tree. Mike laughed, but it sounded forced. "Maybe they're just sleeping in. Come on, let's salvage what we can of breakfast." As the others busied themselves cleaning up the mess and preparing food, I couldn't shake the feeling of wrongness that permeated the air. Every shadow seemed to hide a potential threat, and I found myself jumping at the slightest sound. We ate in tense silence. The cheerful mood of the previous evening completely evaporated. As I picked at my granola bar, a foul, musky odor wafted through our campsite. It was unlike anything I'd ever smelled before, a mixture of wet fur, rotting vegetation, and something else I couldn't quite place. "Do you smell that?" I asked, wrinkling my nose. The others nodded, looking around warily. "Probably just some dead animal nearby," Jason said, but he didn't sound convinced. The smell lingered, seeming to grow stronger as the day wore on. We tried to go about our planned activities, hiking, fishing in a nearby stream, but there was an undercurrent of tension in everything we did. Every snapping twig made us whirl around. Every rustling bush sent our hearts racing. As dusk approached, we gathered around the unlit fire pit, debating what to do. "I think we should leave," I said firmly. "Something's not right here." Sarah nodded in agreement, but Mike and Jason were less convinced. "We've come all this way," Mike argued. "We can't let one weird night and some animal tracks scare us off." "Yeah," Jason chimed in. "Besides, it's getting dark. It's safer to stay put than try to navigate these roads at night." Outvoted, Sarah and I reluctantly agreed to stay one more night. As the others prepared dinner, I volunteered to gather more firewood, needing some time alone to clear my head. I walked to the edge of the clearing, picking up fallen branches as I went. The forest was still unnaturally quiet, the silence broken only by the soft crunch of leaves under my feet. As I bent to pick up a particularly large branch, movement caught my eye. Time seemed to slow as I straightened up, my eyes locked on the tree line. There, partially hidden behind a massive pine, was a dark shape. It was huge, far larger than any bear I'd ever seen, with long arms that nearly touched the ground. For a split second, I caught a glimpse of a face that was terrifyingly human-like, with deep-set eyes that reflected the fading light. I stood frozen, the firewood forgotten at my feet. The creature and I stared at each other, neither moving. Then, faster than I thought possible for something so large, it turned and melted into the forest, leaving nothing but swaying branches in its wake. "Megan? You okay?" Jason's voice snapped me back to reality. He was standing at the edge of the campsite, looking at me with concern. I opened my mouth to tell him what I'd seen, but the words stuck in my throat. Would he believe me? Would any of them? Or would they dismiss it as my imagination running wild? "Yeah," I managed to croak out. "Just thought I saw something. Probably nothing." Jason nodded, but I could see the doubt in his eyes. "Well, come on back. Dinner's almost ready." As we walked back to the campfire, I couldn't shake the image of those eyes staring at me from the forest. I knew with a certainty that chilled me to my core that we were not alone in these woods. Something was out there, watching us, waiting. And as the sun dipped below the horizon, plunging the forest into darkness, I couldn't help but feel that we were no longer the hunters, but the hunted. The night stretched on, each hour feeling like an eternity. Every sound from the forest sent shivers down my spine, and I found myself constantly scanning the tree line, expecting to see that massive shape emerge from the shadows. As we huddled around the campfire, telling stories and trying to maintain a sense of normalcy, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being observed, sized up like prey. Little did I know, as we finally retired to our tents for what we hoped would be a peaceful night's sleep, that the true terror was yet to come. The creature I had glimpsed was still out there, and it was about to make its presence known in a way that would change our lives forever. I don't know how long I had been asleep when the first scream pierced the night, jolting me awake and sending ice through my veins. For a moment I lay frozen in my sleeping bag, convinced I was trapped in a nightmare. But then the scream came again, raw and terrified, and I knew with sickening certainty that this was real. "Sarah?" I called out, my voice trembling. "Mike? Jason?" No one answered. The campsite had fallen into an eerie silence, broken only by the sound of my own ragged breathing. With shaking hands, I fumbled for my flashlight, my heart pounding so hard I thought it might burst from my chest. As I unzipped my tent, the beam of my flashlight caught a blur of dark fur and gleaming eyes just outside. Time seemed to slow as I processed what I was seeing. It was the creature from the forest, the one I had glimpsed earlier. But now it was here, in our campsite, terrifyingly real and close. The beast was massive, easily 8 feet tall, with a body covered in matted dark fur. Its face was a nightmarish blend of ape and human features with a pronounced brow ridge and a mouthful of yellowed teeth. But it was the eyes that paralyzed me with fear, intelligent, predatory, and filled with an otherworldly malevolence. For a split second we stared at each other, the creature and I, locked in a moment of mutual recognition. Then, with a roar that shook the ground beneath me, it turned and lumbered towards the other tents. "Run!" I screamed, finally finding my voice. "Everyone get out! Run!" The campsite erupted into chaos. The sound of ripping fabric filled the air as Bigfoot tore through our tents like they were made of tissue paper. I could hear my friends' panicked shouts and the creature's guttural growls, creating a cacophony of terror. I scrambled out of my tent, my legs nearly giving way beneath me. In the dim moonlight, I could make out shadowy figures running in all directions, trying to escape the rampaging beast. "Sarah," I called out, desperate to find my best friend. "Where are you?" "Megan, help!" Sarah's voice came from somewhere to my left, filled with panic and pain. I turned towards the sound, my flashlight beam cutting through the darkness. What I saw made my blood run cold. Sarah was on the ground, crawling backwards, her leg bent at an unnatural angle. And looming over her, its massive form blocking out the stars, was Bigfoot. Without thinking, I grabbed the nearest object, a heavy camping lantern, and hurled it at the creature. "Hey, over here!" I shouted, trying to draw its attention away from Sarah. The lantern struck Bigfoot's broad back, and for a moment I thought I had made a terrible mistake. The beast turned towards me, its eyes glowing with rage in the flashlight beam. It let out a roar that seemed to shake the very trees around us, and then it charged. I turned and ran, crashing through the underbrush with no thought of direction or destination. Behind me, I could hear the creature's heavy footfalls and the sound of branches snapping under its weight. The forest was a blur of shadows and moonlight as I fled, my lungs burning and branches whipping at my face. Suddenly the ground disappeared beneath my feet. I had run right off the edge of a small ravine. For a heart-stopping moment, I was airborne, and then I hit the ground hard, tumbling down the steep slope. Pain exploded through my body as I rolled over rocks and fallen logs, finally coming to a stop at the bottom. I lay there, dazed and aching, certain that at any moment I would feel the creature's powerful hands grabbing me. But the only sound was my own labored breathing and the distant, terrified shouts of my friends. Slowly, painfully, I pushed myself to my feet. My whole body throbbed and I could feel warm blood trickling down my face from a cut on my forehead. But I was alive, and for the moment, away from the immediate danger. As I stood there trying to catch my breath and get my bearings, a blood-curdling scream echoed through the forest. It was Mike's voice, filled with agony and terror, suddenly cut short. "No," I whispered, tears streaming down my face. "Oh God, no." I wanted to run back to help my friends, but fear kept me rooted to the spot. I was alone in the dark forest, injured and unarmed, with a monster on the loose. What could I possibly do? For what felt like hours, I huddled at the bottom of the ravine, jumping at every sound and imagining Bigfoot's glowing eyes watching me from every shadow. The screams and shouts from the campsite had long since faded, replaced by an oppressive silence that was somehow even worse. As the first light of dawn began to filter through the trees, I finally gathered the courage to move. Every muscle in my body protested as I climbed back up the ravine, using roots and rocks as handholds. When I reached the top, I paused, listening intently for any sign of the creature. But the forest was quiet, save for a few hesitant bird calls. Slowly, cautiously, I made my way back towards our campsite. As I approached, the extent of the destruction became clear. Our tents were shredded, their contents strewn across the clearing. The campfire had been scattered, leaving scorch marks on the ground. And everywhere there were signs of a violent struggle, broken branches, churned up earth, and dark stains that I tried not to look at too closely. "Hello?" I called out weakly, praying that someone would answer. "Is anyone there?" Only silence greeted me. As I stood there, surveying the devastation, the full weight of what had happened began to sink in. My friends were gone, taken by a creature that shouldn't exist. I was alone, injured, and lost in a forest that now felt more like a nightmare realm than a camping destination. A twig snapped somewhere behind me, and I whirled around, my heart leaping into my throat. There, at the edge of the clearing, stood Bigfoot. It was watching me, its massive chest heaving with each breath, its fur matted with what looked horribly like blood. For a moment, we stared at each other across the ruined campsite. I was certain this was the end, that the creature would charge and finish what it had started. But then, to my utter disbelief, it turned and lumbered back into the forest, disappearing among the trees as if it had never been there at all. I stood there, shaking and sobbing as the sun rose over the devastated campsite. I knew I needed to find help, to alert the authorities, but who would believe my story? As I gathered what little remained of our supplies and prepared to find my way back to civilization, I couldn't shake the feeling that this nightmare was far from over. The creature was still out there, and I was the only one left to tell the tale. My legs burned as I ran blindly through the forest, branches whipping my face and terror fueling every step. The devastation at the campsite was burned into my mind, driving me forward despite the exhaustion and pain that threatened to overwhelm me. I had no idea where I was going. My only thought was to put as much distance as possible between myself and that thing. The forest was a blur of green and brown, shadows dancing at the edge of my vision. Every snapping twig, Every rustle of leaves sent a fresh surge of adrenaline through my body. Was it following me? I didn't dare look back to check. "Help!" I screamed, my voice hoarse and barely audible over the pounding of my heart. "Somebody, please help me." But there was no answer, no sign of rescue. Just the endless trees and the growing certainty that I was hopelessly lost. I don't know how long I ran. Time seemed to lose all meaning in the green twilight of the forest, but eventually my body began to betray me. My lungs burned with each ragged breath and my legs felt like lead. I stumbled, my foot catching on an exposed root, and suddenly I was falling. The world spun around me as I tumbled down a steep embankment. Rocks and branches tore at my skin and clothes. I tried to protect my head, but it was useless. I was completely at the mercy of gravity and the unforgiving forest floor. When I finally came to a stop at the bottom of the ravine, I lay there, dazed and gasping for air. Every part of my body screamed in pain. I could taste blood in my mouth and my vision swam with dark spots. "Get up," I whispered to myself, fighting against the urge to just close my eyes and give in to the exhaustion. "You have to get up, Megan." Slowly, agonizingly, I pushed myself to my hands and knees. The world tilted dangerously, and I had to pause, fighting back a wave of nausea. That's when I heard it. A low, rumbling growl that seemed to come from everywhere at once. My head snapped up, eyes darting frantically around the ravine. The steep walls rose on either side of me, thick with undergrowth and shadows. Perfect hiding places for a predator. "No," I whimpered, struggling to my feet. "Please, no." I could hear the creature's heavy footfalls now, getting closer with each passing second. The sound echoed off the ravine walls, making it impossible to pinpoint its location. I pressed myself against the rocky wall, hoping against hope that somehow I could make myself invisible. A branch snapped nearby, and I turned just in time to see a massive, dark shape emerge from the undergrowth. Bigfoot stood there, barely 10 feet away, its breath coming in heavy snorts that sent clouds of vapor into the cool air. Its eyes glowing with an unnatural intelligence fixed on me with predatory focus. For a moment, we were locked in a terrifying standoff. I couldn't move, couldn't breathe, couldn't even think. All I could do was stare into those eyes, seeing my own death reflected back at me. Then, with a roar that shook leaves from the trees, it charged. I don't remember deciding to run. One moment I was frozen in terror, the next I was scrambling up the opposite side of the ravine, my hands clawing at roots and rocks in a desperate bid for escape. I could hear the creature behind me, its massive body crashing through the underbrush with terrifying speed. "Help!" I screamed again, knowing it was futile but unable to stop myself. "Someone, please!" I reached the top of the ravine and kept running, branches whipping my face and tearing at my clothes. I had no idea where I was going, no plan beyond the primal need to escape. Behind me, I could hear the creature's frustrated howls growing more distant. Was I actually outrunning it? Hope surged through me, giving me a fresh burst of energy. I pushed myself harder, ignoring the burning in my lungs and the sharp pain in my side. Just a little further, I told myself. Just a little more and you'll be safe. That's when my foot caught on a root, sending me tumbling to the forest floor. I hit the ground hard, the impact driving the air from my lungs. For a moment, I lay there stunned and gasping for breath. As I struggled to get up, I became aware of a new sound: water. Somewhere nearby, I could hear the rush of a river or stream. Water meant civilization, possible rescue. With renewed determination, I pushed myself to my feet and staggered towards the sound. I broke through the tree line and found myself on the bank of a fast-moving river. The water churned and frothed over rocks, creating a deafening roar that drowned out all other sounds. For a moment, I stood there, unsure what to do. I was a strong swimmer, but the current looked treacherous. A crash in the underbrush behind me made the decision for me. Without hesitation, I plunged into the icy water. The shock of the cold nearly paralyzed me, but fear and adrenaline kept me moving. I struck out for the opposite bank, fighting against the current that threatened to sweep me away. Water filled my mouth and nose, and my sodden clothes dragged at me like lead weights. Just when I thought I couldn't go on, my feet touched the bottom. With the last of my strength, I dragged myself onto the far bank, collapsing onto the rocky shore. For several minutes I lay there, coughing and shivering, too exhausted to move. When I finally managed to lift my head, I saw the creature standing on the opposite bank. Even from this distance, I could see the fury in its eyes as it paced back and forth, clearly unwilling to enter the water. A hysterical laugh bubbled up in my throat. I had done it. I had escaped. But my relief was short-lived. As I watched, the creature turned and melted back into the forest, disappearing as silently as it had appeared. And I realized with growing dread that my ordeal was far from over. I was lost, injured, and alone in a wilderness that now held unimaginable dangers. Night was falling, and with it the temperature was dropping rapidly. If I didn't find help soon, exposure would finish what Bigfoot had started. With trembling hands, I pushed myself to my feet. Every muscle in my body screamed in protest, but I forced myself to start walking. I had to find help, had to tell someone what had happened. But as I stumbled along the riverbank, a new fear began to gnaw at me. Who would believe my story? Who would accept that a creature out of myth and legend had attacked our campsite and taken my friends? As the last light faded from the sky and the forest plunged into darkness, I realized that surviving Bigfoot might have been the easy part. Convincing the world of what I had seen, that would be the real challenge. And somewhere in the gathering darkness behind me, I knew the creature was still out there, waiting, watching, ready to silence the only witness to its existence. The darkness of the forest pressed in around me as I stumbled along the riverbank, every shadow seeming to hide the monstrous form of Bigfoot. My clothes, still damp from the river crossing, clung to my skin, making me shiver in the cool night air. Each step was agony, my body battered and bruised from the fall down the ravine and the desperate flight through the woods. I don't know how long I walked, time losing all meaning in the endless expanse of trees and darkness. But eventually my legs gave out, and I collapsed to the forest floor, gasping for breath. As I lay there, trying to summon the strength to keep moving, a sound cut through the night, a low, rumbling growl that I now knew all too well. Terror gave me a fresh surge of energy, and I scrambled to my feet, eyes darting wildly around the darkened forest. That's when I saw it, a hollow log, partially hidden by ferns and fallen leaves. Without thinking, I dove for it, crawling inside and pressing myself as far back as I could go. The log was damp and musty, filled with rotting wood and who knew what kind of insects. But at that moment, it felt like the safest place in the world. I held my breath, straining my ears for any sound of approach. For a long moment there was nothing but the usual nighttime sounds of the forest, the rustle of leaves, the distant hoot of an owl. Then I heard it, heavy footsteps, slow and deliberate, coming closer. My heart was pounding so hard I was sure it would give me away. I bit my lip to keep from whimpering, tasting blood as my teeth broke the skin. The footsteps stopped just outside my hiding place, and a foul, musky odor filled the air, so strong it made my eyes water. I could hear the creature sniffing, searching for my scent. Its massive, hairy arm reached into the log, searching for me. I pressed myself even further back, feeling splinters digging into my skin, but I didn't dare move. The creature's hand was so close I could feel the heat radiating from it, see the dirt caked under its thick, yellowed nails. "Please," I whispered, though I don't know who or what I was praying to. "Please don't find me." The wood creaked and groaned as the creature tried to break open my sanctuary, splinters raining down on me. I closed my eyes, certain that this was the end. Any second now, those powerful hands would grab me, drag me out to meet my fate. But then, just when I thought all was lost, a distant sound drew the monster away. It might have been another animal, or perhaps just the wind playing tricks, but whatever it was enough to distract Bigfoot. I heard its heavy footsteps moving away, fading into the distance. I lay there, shaking and sobbing silently, for what felt like hours. Every muscle in my body was tensed, waiting for the creature to return. But as time passed and the forest remained quiet, I began to hope that maybe, just maybe, I had escaped. Slowly, painfully, I crawled out of the log. The forest was still dark, but a faint glow on the horizon suggested that dawn wasn't far off. I stood on shaky legs, trying to get my bearings. Which way had I come from? Which way should I go now? As I stood there, indecision paralyzing me, a twig snapped somewhere in the darkness. I whirled around, my heart leaping into my throat. There, at the edge of my vision, I caught a glimpse of something massive moving through the trees. It was too quick to identify, but I knew in my gut what it was. "No," I whispered, backing away slowly. "No, no, no." I turned and ran, no longer caring about direction or stealth. All that mattered was putting distance between myself and that thing. Branches whipped at my face, roots threatened to trip me at every step, but fear drove me on. I don't know how long I ran. Time seemed to blur, the forest an endless maze of shadows and terror. But eventually I burst out of the tree line and found myself in a small clearing. In the center stood an old, dilapidated cabin, its windows dark and empty. For a moment I hesitated. The cabin looked abandoned, possibly dangerous. But another growl from the forest behind me made up my mind. I sprinted across the clearing and threw myself at the cabin door, praying it wasn't locked. The door gave way with a groan of rusty hinges, and I tumbled inside, slamming it shut behind me. I fumbled in the darkness until I found a heavy piece of furniture, a bookcase maybe, and dragged it in front of the door. Only then, with a barricade between me and the monster outside, did I allow myself to breathe. The cabin was musty and cold, filled with shadows that seemed to move in the corners of my vision, but it was shelter, and for the moment that was enough. I sank to the floor, my back against the makeshift barricade, and tried to think. What was I going to do? I was lost in the wilderness, being hunted by a creature that shouldn't exist. Even if I managed to find my way back to civilization, who would believe my story? A sound outside made me freeze. Heavy footsteps circled the cabin, accompanied by that now familiar growl. I held my breath, praying that the old walls would hold, that the creature wouldn't find a way in. The footsteps stopped in front of the door. For a long moment, there was silence. Then, with a roar that shook the entire cabin, Bigfoot began to pound on the door. The wood creaked and splintered under the assault, and I knew it was only a matter of time before it gave way. Panicked, I looked around the cabin for anything I could use as a weapon. My eyes fell on an old fireplace poker leaning against the wall. I scrambled for it, gripping the rusty metal like a lifeline. The door was beginning to splinter, the bookcase shifting with each powerful blow. In moments, the creature would be through. I raised the poker, knowing it was a pitiful defense against the monster's strength, but determined to go down fighting. Just as I thought the door would give way, a new sound cut through the night. An engine, growing louder by the second. Headlights swept across the cabin windows, and I heard voices calling out. "Hello? Is someone there?" We heard noises. The pounding on the door stopped abruptly. Through a crack in the boards covering the window, I saw a massive shape melt back into the forest, disappearing as if it had never been there. "Help!" I screamed, my voice hoarse and barely recognizable. "I'm in here, please help me." I heard footsteps approaching, human footsteps this time, and voices filled with concern. As the newcomers worked to clear the barricade from the door, I sank to the floor, overwhelmed by relief and exhaustion. I was safe for now. But as the door finally opened, and I saw the shocked faces of my rescuers, a new fear gripped me. How could I possibly explain what had happened? Who would believe the horror I had experienced? As the first rays of dawn broke over the forest, I realized that my ordeal was far from over. The night of terror might be ending, but the real challenge was just beginning. As the adrenaline from my narrow escape began to fade, Exhaustion hit me like a physical blow. My rescuers, a middle-aged couple named Tom and Linda, who owned a nearby cabin, helped me to my feet and out of the dilapidated structure. "What happened to you, honey?" Linda asked, her eyes wide with concern as she took in my battered appearance. I opened my mouth to explain, but the words caught in my throat. How could I possibly describe the horror I had experienced? Would they even believe me? I got lost, I managed to stammer. My friends, we were camping and something attacked us. Tom's brow furrowed. Something? Like a bear? I shook my head, feeling tears welling up in my eyes. No, not a bear. It was bigger, more human-like. The couple exchanged a look I couldn't quite decipher. Concern? Skepticism? "Let's get you back to our cabin," Linda said gently. "You can rest and we'll call for help." As we walked through the forest, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. Every shadow seemed to hide a lurking threat, and I found myself jumping at the slightest sound. Tom and Linda tried to engage me in conversation, asking about where I was from and how I had ended up in the woods alone, but I could only give short, disjointed answers. My mind was still reeling from the night's events. We reached their cabin just as the sun was beginning to peek over the horizon. It was a cozy, well-maintained structure, so different from the abandoned shack where I had sought refuge. Under normal circumstances, I would have found it charming. Now it just felt exposed. "Why don't you sit down, dear?" Linda said, guiding me to a comfortable armchair. "I'll make some tea, and Tom will call the ranger station." I nodded numbly, sinking into the chair. My body ached all over, and I could feel the sticky warmth of blood from various cuts and scrapes. But physical pain was nothing compared to the terror that still gripped my heart. As Linda busied herself in the kitchen and Tom spoke in low tones on the phone, I found my gaze drawn to the large picture window that looked out over the forest. The trees stood silent and still in the early morning light, betraying no sign of the monster that lurked within their depths. Suddenly, a movement caught my eye. There, just at the edge of the tree line, a massive shape shifted in the shadows. My heart leapt into my throat as I recognized the hulking form of Bigfoot. It stood there, partially hidden by the foliage, its eyes fixed on the cabin. On me. "It's here," I whispered, my voice barely audible. "What was that, dear?" Linda asked, returning with a steaming mug of tea. I tore my gaze away from the window to look at her. "It's out there. The thing that attacked us. It followed me here." Linda's expression was a mixture of concern and doubt. She glanced out the window, then back at me. "I don't see anything, honey. Maybe you should lie down for a bit. You've been through a lot." I turned back to the window, ready to point out the creature, but the spot where it had stood was empty. Had I imagined it? Was my mind playing tricks on me? "The Rangers are on their way," Tom announced, entering the room. "They should be here in about an hour. In the meantime, why don't you tell us what happened?" I took a deep breath, trying to organize my thoughts. How could I explain what I had seen, what I had experienced, without sounding completely insane? "We were camping," I began hesitantly. "Me and my friends. Everything was fine at first, but then something started stalking our campsite. We thought it was just an animal at first, maybe a bear, but it was so much worse." I described the attack as best I could, the destruction of our campsite, the terrifying chase through the woods. Tom and Linda listened silently, their expressions growing more concerned and more skeptical as my story unfolded. "And you're sure it wasn't a bear?" Tom asked when I finished. "The Rangers have reported some aggressive black bears in the area recently." I shook my head vehemently. "No, it wasn't a bear. It was Bigfoot. I know how that sounds, but I swear it's the truth. It was huge and walked on two legs and it was intelligent. It hunted us." The silence that followed was deafening. I could see the doubt in their eyes, the unspoken question of whether the trauma had affected my mind. "Sweetie," Linda said gently, You've been through a terrible ordeal. Sometimes when we're scared, our minds can play tricks on us. Why don't you rest until the Rangers get here? They'll be able to help sort everything out." I wanted to argue, to make them understand the very real danger we were all in, but exhaustion was overtaking me. My eyelids felt heavy, and the warmth of the cabin was a stark contrast to the cold terror of the night. As I drifted off to sleep, I caught one last glimpse out the window. There, just for a moment, I saw a pair of eyes watching from the forest. Intelligent, predatory eyes that I knew would haunt my dreams. I don't know how long I slept, but I was jolted awake by a loud knock at the door. My heart raced as Tom went to answer it, half expecting to see Bigfoot's massive form filling the doorway. Instead, 2 forest rangers entered, their uniforms a comforting sight of authority and normalcy. "Miss Lee?" one of them said, approaching me. "I'm Ranger Johnson, and this is Ranger Martinez. We understand you've had quite an ordeal. Can you tell us what happened?" I took a deep breath, steeling myself. This was my chance to tell my story, to get help. But as I looked into their expectant faces, I realized the enormity of the task before me. How could I make them believe in something that defied all logic and reason? As I began to speak, I couldn't shake the feeling that somewhere out there in the forest, Bigfoot was waiting, watching, and I knew with chilling certainty that this long night of terror was far from over. The first rays of sunlight found me huddled in a cave, every muscle aching and my mind reeling from the night's horrors. I had no idea how long I'd been running or how far I'd come. The events of the past hours blurred together in a nightmarish haze of terror and exhaustion. As consciousness slowly returned, I became acutely aware of my surroundings. The cave was shallow, barely more than an indentation in the rocky hillside. Damp moss covered the walls and the air was thick with the musty smell of decay. But it was shelter, and for the moment that was enough. I sat up gingerly, wincing at the pain that shot through my body. My clothes were torn and caked with mud, and I could feel the sting of countless cuts and bruises. But I was alive, which seemed like a miracle given what I'd been through. "Okay, Megan," I whispered to myself, my voice hoarse and barely recognizable. "You need to move. You need to find help." Slowly, painfully, I crawled to the cave entrance and peered out. The forest stretched before me, bathed in the soft golden light of dawn. It looked peaceful, almost beautiful, but I knew the terror that lurked within its depths. I scanned the tree line, half expecting to see the massive, hulking form of Bigfoot emerge from the shadows. But there was nothing, just the gentle rustling of leaves in the morning breeze and the distant call of a bird. Taking a deep breath, I stepped out of the cave. The cool morning air felt good on my skin, a stark contrast to the suffocating fear of the night. I had no idea which direction to go, but I knew I couldn't stay here. Sooner or later the creature would find me. I chose a direction at random and started walking, keeping my senses on high alert for any sign of danger. As I moved, I tried to piece together a plan. I needed to find civilization to alert the authorities about what had happened, but even as I thought it, doubt crept in. Who would believe me? The story sounded insane even to my own ears, and I had lived through it. After what felt like hours of walking, I stumbled upon a clearing. My heart leapt as I saw a small, rustic cabin nestled among the trees. Smoke curled from its chimney, a sign of life that brought tears to my eyes. Gathering my remaining strength, I staggered towards the cabin. "Hello?" I called out, my voice cracking. "Is anyone there? Please, I need help." The door opened, and an elderly man stepped out, his eyes widening as he took in my battered appearance. "Good Lord, girl, what happened to you?" Before I could answer, a wave of dizziness washed over me. The world tilted sideways, and I felt myself falling. The last thing I remember is the man's weathered face looming over me, his voice calling out in alarm. When I came to, I was lying on a worn but comfortable couch inside the cabin. A fire crackled in the hearth, and the smell of coffee filled the air. For a moment, I thought it had all been a terrible dream. "Ah, you're awake," a gravelly voice said. I turned to see the old man sitting in a rocking chair nearby, a steaming mug in his hands. "You gave me quite a scare there, young lady. Name's Frank. What's yours?" "Megan," I croaked, my throat dry and sore. "Megan Lee. Thank you for helping me." Frank nodded, his bushy eyebrows furrowing with concern. "Don't mention it. Now, want to tell me what you're doing out here all alone, looking like you've been through a war?" I sat up slowly, accepting the glass of water he offered. As I sipped, I tried to figure out how to explain what had happened. The truth seemed impossible, but I couldn't bring myself to lie. I was camping with friends," I began hesitantly. "But something attacked us. Something big." Frank leaned forward, his expression serious. "A bear?" I shook my head. "No, not a bear. It walked on two legs. It was intelligent. It hunted us." I expected to see disbelief or skepticism in Frank's eyes, but instead, I saw a flicker of recognition. He set down his mug and stood up, walking to the window to peer out at the forest. "You saw it, didn't you?" he said quietly. "The creature." My heart skipped a beat. You believe me?" Frank turned back to me, his face grave. "I've lived in these woods for 40 years, Megan. I've seen things that most people wouldn't believe. Things that don't belong in this world." A mix of relief and fear washed over me. Finally, someone who didn't think I was crazy. But his words also confirmed my worst fears. The creature was real and it was still out there. "What is it?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Frank shook his head. "I don't know for sure. Some call it Bigfoot, others Sasquatch. All I know is it's dangerous and it's been more active lately." As if on cue, a low rumbling growl echoed from the forest. We both froze, our eyes locked on the window. For a heart-stopping moment, I saw a massive shape move between the trees, just at the edge of the clearing. "It followed me," I whispered, terror gripping my heart. "Oh God, it followed me here." Frank moved quickly, grabbing a shotgun from above the fireplace. "Stay inside," he ordered, his voice tense. "I'm going to check it out." "No," I cried, grabbing his arm. "Please don't go out there. It'll kill you." He patted my hand reassuringly. "Don't worry, girl. I've dealt with this thing before. It won't catch me off guard." Before I could protest further, Frank was out the door, his shotgun at the ready. I watched from the window, my heart pounding so hard I thought it might burst from my chest. Frank moved cautiously across the clearing, his eyes scanning the tree line. The forest had gone eerily silent, as if holding its breath. Then, suddenly, a roar shattered the stillness. A massive, dark shape burst from the trees, moving with impossible speed for something so large. "Frank!" I screamed, but my voice was drowned out by the sound of the shotgun firing. The creature stumbled, momentarily stunned by the blast, but it quickly recovered, charging towards Frank with renewed fury. I watched in horror as the old man was knocked to the ground, the shotgun flying from his grasp. Without thinking, I ran out of the cabin, grabbing a heavy axe that leaned against the porch. "Hey!" I yelled, my voice shrill with fear and adrenaline. "Over here!" The creature's head snapped towards me, its eyes gleaming with malevolent intelligence. For a moment, our gazes locked, and I felt a chill run down my spine. There was something almost human in those eyes, but twisted, filled with a primal rage that defied explanation. Time seemed to stand still as we stared at each other, my fate hanging in the balance of this monstrous game of chicken. Then, with a roar that shook the very ground, it charged towards me. I stood my ground, the axe raised, knowing I had only one chance. As the creature reached me, I swung with all my might. The blade connected with a sickening thud, and a howl of pain filled the air. The force of the impact sent me stumbling backwards. I fell hard, the axe slipping from my grasp. Looking up, I saw the creature looming over me, dark blood matting its fur where I had struck it. Its massive hand reached for me, and I knew with certainty that this was the end. But then, a gunshot rang out. Frank had regained his shotgun and fired again, the blast catching the creature in the shoulder. It roared in pain and fury, but the fight seemed to go out of it. With one last hate-filled glance at me, it turned and lumbered back into the forest, disappearing among the trees as if it had never been there at all. I lay on the ground, gasping for breath, unable to believe I was still alive. Frank hurried over, his face pale but determined. "We need to go," he said urgently, helping me to my feet. "It'll be back, and next time it won't be caught off guard." As we hurried to Frank's old pickup truck, I couldn't shake the image of those eyes staring into mine. The creature was still out there, wounded and angry, and I knew with a certainty that chilled me to my core that this nightmare was far from over. Frank's old pickup truck rumbled down the winding forest road, each bump and jolt sending waves of pain through my battered body. The adrenaline from our encounter with Bigfoot was wearing off, leaving me feeling drained and disoriented. I stared out the window at the passing trees, half expecting to see a massive, fur-covered shape lurking among them. "We're heading to the ranger station," Frank said, breaking the tense silence. "They need to know what's happening out here." I nodded numbly, unsure of what to say. How could we possibly explain what we'd seen, what we'd experienced? It all seemed so surreal now, sitting in the relative safety of Frank's truck. As we approached the ranger station, I felt a mix of relief and apprehension. Relief at the prospect of safety and help, but apprehension about how our story would be received. The rational part of my mind knew how crazy it would sound to anyone who hadn't lived through it. Frank parked the truck, and we made our way inside. The station was a small, rustic building, its walls adorned with maps and wildlife posters. A middle-aged man in a ranger uniform looked up as we entered, his eyes widening as he took in our disheveled appearance. "Frank, what in the world happened to you two?" he asked, rushing over to us. "Jim," Frank said gravely, "we've got a situation out there. Something big, something dangerous." The ranger, Jim, led us to a small seating area and called for his colleague to bring a first aid kit. As he began tending to our wounds, Frank recounted our encounter with Bigfoot. I watched Jim's face carefully, seeing the initial concern give way to skepticism. "A bear attack, maybe?" Jim suggested, applying antiseptic to a cut on my arm. "We've had reports of some aggressive black bears in the area recently." I shook my head vehemently. "It wasn't a bear," I insisted, my voice hoarse but determined. "I saw it clearly. It was huge, walked on two legs. It was intelligent. It hunted us." Jim's expression softened, but I could see the doubt in his eyes. "Miss, you've been through a traumatic experience. Sometimes our minds can play tricks on us when we're scared." Frustration welled up inside me. "I know what I saw," I said, fighting to keep my voice steady. "It was Bigfoot. I know how that sounds, but it's the truth." The ranger exchanged a look with his colleague, who had just returned with more supplies. It was a look I was becoming all too familiar with, a mixture of pity and disbelief. "Why don't you tell me exactly what happened from the beginning?" Jim said, pulling out a notepad. I took a deep breath and recounted the events of the past day and night, the camping trip, the first signs of something wrong, the attack on our campsite, my desperate flight through the forest, and finally, the encounter at Frank's cabin. As I spoke, I could see Jim's expression growing more and more skeptical. When I finished, there was a long moment of silence. Jim cleared his throat. "That's quite a story, Miss Lee. We'll certainly investigate the area where you were camping. But I have to be honest, what you're describing doesn't match any known wildlife in this region." "Because it's not wildlife," I exclaimed, frustration getting the better of me. "It's Bigfoot. I know it sounds crazy, but—" "Megan," Frank interrupted gently, placing a hand on my arm. "Maybe we should let the rangers do their job. They'll find evidence of whatever it was." I turned to him, betrayal stinging in my chest. "You saw it too, Frank. You know I'm telling the truth." Frank nodded, but his eyes were sad. "I saw something, that's for sure. But in the light of day, well, maybe we both got a little carried away." I couldn't believe what I was hearing. Frank, the one person who had believed me, was now backing down. I felt utterly alone. Jim stood up, his notepad tucked away. "We'll send a team out to investigate the area. In the meantime, I think you both should get checked out at the hospital. You've been through a lot, and it's important to make sure there are no serious injuries." As if on cue, a siren sounded outside. The ambulance Jim had called earlier had arrived. Paramedics entered the station, and soon I found myself being ushered onto a stretcher despite my protest that I could walk. As they loaded me into the ambulance, I caught sight of a local news van pulling up to the ranger station. A reporter and cameraman jumped out, no doubt eager for a story about the mysterious animal attack in the woods. "Wait," I called out to Jim, who was speaking with the paramedics. "You have to warn people. That thing is still out there. It's dangerous." Jim's face was a mask of professional concern, but I could see the doubt behind his eyes. "We'll take care of it, Miss Lee. You just focus on getting better." As the ambulance doors closed and we began to move, I felt a wave of despair wash over me. No one believed me. The creature was still out there, and no one was taking the threat seriously. The ride to the hospital was a blur. I answered the paramedics' questions mechanically, my mind still reeling from everything that had happened. When we arrived, I was whisked away for a battery of tests and examinations. Hours later, I found myself in a hospital bed, hooked up to various monitors. A doctor entered, clipboard in hand. "Well, Miss Lee," he said, his tone friendly but clinical, "you've got quite a collection of cuts and bruises, and you're suffering from exhaustion and mild dehydration. But overall, you're in remarkably good shape considering what you've been through." I nodded, not trusting myself to speak. The doctor continued, his voice taking on a gentler tone. "The Rangers filled us in on what happened. I understand you believe you saw something unusual in the forest." I tensed, knowing what was coming next. "It's not uncommon for the mind to create vivid hallucinations in times of extreme stress," he said. "What you experienced was very real to you, but—" "It was real," I interrupted, my voice barely above a whisper. "I'm not crazy, I know what I saw." The doctor patted my hand sympathetically. "No one's saying you're crazy, Megan. But trauma can affect our perceptions. I'd like you to speak with one of our psychiatrists before you're discharged." I turned away, staring out the window at the forest in the distance. Somewhere out there, Bigfoot was still roaming free, while I lay here, dismissed as a hysterical camper suffering from trauma-induced hallucinations. As the doctor left, I overheard him speaking to a nurse outside my room. "Poor girl," he said. "Make sure Psych does a full evaluation before release." I closed my eyes, fighting back tears of frustration. How could I make them understand? How could I convince them of the very real danger lurking in those woods? As night fell, casting long shadows across my hospital room, I couldn't shake the feeling that this was far from over. Bigfoot was still out there, and I was the only one who knew the truth. The question was, what was I going to do about it? Weeks had passed since that horrific night in the forest, but the memories remained as vivid as ever. I had been released from the hospital, deemed physically recovered but emotionally fragile by well-meaning doctors who insisted I was suffering from post-traumatic stress and hallucinations. My parents had come to take me home, their faces etched with worry and confusion as I tried unsuccessfully to explain what had really happened. But I knew the truth. And that truth pulled me back to the edge of those woods on a crisp autumn morning, weeks after my ordeal. I stood at the forest's edge, my heart pounding in my chest, every instinct screaming at me to turn and run. But I couldn't. I needed closure, needed to prove to myself that I wasn't crazy. "You don't have to do this, Megan," my therapist had said during our last session. "Returning to the scene of a traumatic event can sometimes do more harm than good." But here I was, drawn back by an inexplicable need for... what? Validation? Closure? I wasn't sure. Taking a deep breath, I stepped into the forest. The familiar scents of pine and damp earth filled my nostrils. bringing with them a flood of memories. I tried to focus on retracing the path of our ill-fated camping trip, but every snapping twig and rustle of leaves sent my heart racing. As I walked, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. The forest seemed to press in around me, the trees looming overhead like silent sentinels. I found myself constantly looking over my shoulder, half expecting to see a massive fur-covered shape lurking in the shadows. After what felt like hours of walking, I stumbled upon a clearing that made my blood run cold. It was our old campsite, now overgrown but still bearing the scars of that terrible night. Torn fabric from our shredded tents peeked out from beneath new growth. The fire pit, once the center of our cheerful gatherings, now sat cold and filled with leaves. I stood there, frozen, as memories washed over me. The laughter of my friends, the warmth of the fire, the sudden terror as we realized we weren't alone. And then, the attack. A low, familiar growl froze me in place. It was a sound that had haunted my nightmares for weeks, a sound I had hoped never to hear again. Slowly I turned, my heart pounding so hard I thought it might burst from my chest. There, at the edge of the clearing, stood Bigfoot. It was just as massive and terrifying as I remembered, its dark fur matted and its eyes gleaming with an intelligence that was anything but human. We stared at each other across the clearing, and in that moment I knew with certainty that this encounter would haunt me forever. Time seemed to stand still as we faced each other. Part of me wanted to run, to scream, to do anything but stand there. But I was rooted to the spot, unable to look away from those piercing eyes. The creature took a step forward, and I instinctively stepped back, my foot catching on a root. I stumbled, nearly falling, and in that moment of vulnerability, I saw something change in Bigfoot's eyes. The intelligence was replaced by something primal, something hungry. It charged, covering the distance between us with impossible speed. I turned to run, but I knew it was futile. I could hear its heavy footfalls behind me, feel its hot breath on the back of my neck. Just as I felt its massive hand about to close around me, I jerked awake with a scream. I was in my bedroom, tangled in sweat-soaked sheets, my heart racing. It took me a moment to realize where I was, that it had all been a dream, a nightmare. But it had felt so real, so vivid. As my breathing slowly returned to normal, I became aware of hurried footsteps in the hallway. My bedroom door burst open and my parents rushed in, their faces etched with concern. "Megan, are you all right?" my mother asked, sitting on the edge of my bed and pulling me into a hug. I nodded, not trusting my voice just yet. My father stood in the doorway, his expression a mixture of worry and helplessness. Was it the dream again?" he asked softly. I nodded again, feeling tears well up in my eyes. "It felt so real," I whispered. "I was back there in the forest, and it was there too." My parents exchanged a look I had become all too familiar with, a combination of concern and doubt. They wanted to believe me, I knew, but how could they? The story was too fantastic, too unbelievable. "Sweetheart," my mother said gently, stroking my hair. Maybe it's time we considered what Dr. Thompson suggested, the new medication." "No," I said firmly, pulling away. "I don't need medication. I'm not crazy, Mom. What I saw was real." "We're not saying you're crazy," my father interjected, his voice calm but strained. "But you've been through a traumatic experience. Sometimes our minds can play tricks on us," I finished bitterly. "Create vivid hallucinations? I've heard it all before, Dad. But I know what I saw, what I experienced." An uncomfortable silence fell over the room. I could see the pain and frustration in my parents' eyes, mirroring my own. They wanted to help, but how could they when they didn't believe me? "I need some air," I said abruptly, throwing off my covers and standing up. "Megan, it's the middle of the night," my mother protested. "I'm just going to sit on the porch," I assured her. "I'll be fine." Before they could object further, I grabbed a sweater and headed downstairs. The cool night air felt good on my flushed skin as I settled into the porch swing. Above me, the stars twinkled in a clear sky, so different from the oppressive canopy of the forest. As I sat there, trying to shake off the lingering terror of my nightmare, I couldn't help but feel utterly alone. No one believed me. Not my parents, not the doctors, not even Frank, who had seen the creature with his own eyes but now doubted his memory. I was the only one who knew the truth. The only one who understood the very real danger that lurked in those woods. And as I stared out into the darkness, I couldn't shake the feeling that somewhere out there, Bigfoot was still roaming free, still hunting, still waiting. A twig snapped in the darkness beyond our yard, and I felt my heart skip a beat. Logically, I knew it was probably just a raccoon or a stray cat. But a part of me, the part that still woke up screaming most nights, wondered if the creature had somehow followed me home. As I peered into the shadows, straining my eyes for any sign of movement, I realized that this nightmare was far from over. The encounter in the forest may have been unique, but its effects would linger with me forever. I was safe here, on my porch in the suburbs, far from the deep woods where Bigfoot roamed. But in my mind, in my memories, I would always be back in that forest, running for my life from a monster that no one else believed existed. I wrapped my arms around myself, suddenly cold despite the mild night. The truth was a heavy burden, and it was mine alone to bear. As I sat there, watching the night and listening for sounds that I prayed I wouldn't hear, I wondered if I would ever truly feel safe again. I wake up screaming most nights. The memory of Bigfoot's attack is fresh as if it happened yesterday. Tonight is no different. As I bolt upright in bed, my heart racing and sweat soaking my pajamas, I half expect to see the creature's massive form looming over me in the darkness of my bedroom. But there's nothing there. Just the familiar shadows of my furniture and the soft glow of the nightlight my parents insisted I keep on. I take a deep, shuddering breath, trying to calm my nerves. It's been months since that horrific night in the forest, but the terror feels as real as ever. I glance at the clock on my nightstand. 3:17 a.m. Too early to start the day, but I know from experience that sleep won't come again easily. With a sigh, I swing my legs over the side of the bed and make my way downstairs, careful not to wake my parents. They've been through enough worry on my account. In the kitchen, I pour myself a glass of water and lean against the counter, staring out the window at the dark backyard. The trees at the edge of our property sway gently in the night breeze, their shadows dancing in a way that makes my skin crawl. I know logically that Bigfoot isn't out there. We're miles from the forest where it all happened. But logic doesn't hold much sway over my fears these days. As I sip my water, my gaze falls on the pile of papers on the kitchen table. Research I've been doing, trying to find any shred of evidence that might validate my experience. Newspaper clippings about mysterious sightings in the area, printouts from cryptozoology websites, even a few blurry photographs that claim to show Bigfoot. My obsession with proving the existence of the creature has taken over my life. I've pushed away friends who grew tired of hearing about it, strained my relationship with my parents, who worry about my mental health, and even dropped out of college to focus on my research. I know it's not healthy, but I can't seem to stop. The need to validate my experience, to prove I'm not crazy, has become all-consuming. I shuffle through the papers, rereading articles I've practically memorized by now. One catches my eye. A local news report about strange animal attacks in the forest where my encounter took place. The authorities blame it on an aggressive bear, but I know better. The description of the destruction, the unusual footprints found at the scene, it all matches what I experienced. My hand shakes slightly as I pick up my phone. Before I can talk myself out of it, I dial the number listed at the bottom of the article. Hello? A groggy voice answers after several rings. Is this Park Ranger Johnson? I ask, my voice barely above a whisper. Yes, who's this? Do you know what time it is? I take a deep breath. My name is Megan Lee. I was involved in an incident in your park a few months ago, an animal attack. There's a pause on the other end of the line. When Ranger Johnson speaks again, his voice is more alert, tinged with recognition and something else. Wariness, maybe. Miss Lee, yes, I remember. Is everything all right? Are you having some kind of emergency? No, no emergency, I assure him quickly. I saw the article about the recent attacks. I think it might be connected to what happened to me and my friends. Another pause, longer this time. When he responds, his tone is carefully neutral. Miss Lee, we've been over this. The incident you experienced was tragic, but it was a bear attack. These new incidents are also being handled as bear-related. I feel frustration bubbling up inside me. But it wasn't a bear. I told you what I saw. It was bigger, it walked on two legs, it was intelligent. Megan, he interrupts, his voice gentle but firm. I understand you've been through a traumatic experience, but there's no evidence to support the existence of what you think you saw. We've thoroughly investigated the area multiple times. But, I'm sorry, but I can't continue this conversation. If you're still struggling with what happened, I urge you to speak with a professional. Good night, Miss Lee. The line goes dead. I stand there, phone still pressed to my ear, fighting back tears of frustration and despair. Why won't anyone believe me? I spend the rest of the night at my computer, scouring the internet for similar stories, desperate for validation of my experience. As the first light of dawn filters through the windows, I realize I've fallen down yet another rabbit hole of Bigfoot sightings and conspiracy theories. My parents find me there when they come down for breakfast, bleary-eyed and surrounded by printouts. Oh, Megan, my mother sighs, her voice heavy with concern. Not again. Honey, you need to stop this. It's not healthy. I look up at her, seeing the worry etched on her face. Mom, I know what I saw. I can't just pretend it didn't happen. My father places a hand on my shoulder. We're not asking you to pretend, sweetheart. But maybe it's time to consider that your mind might have played tricks on you that night. You were scared, in shock. No, I snap, shrugging off his hand. I'm not crazy. It was real. Bigfoot is real, and it's still out there. Why won't anyone believe me? The hurt in their eyes is almost more than I can bear. I know they're trying to help, but their disbelief feels like a betrayal. I push back from the table, nearly knocking over my chair in my haste to leave the room. I need some air, I mutter, grabbing my jacket and heading for the door. Outside, the crisp morning air helps clear my head a little. I walk aimlessly through our quiet suburban neighborhood, trying to sort through my tumultuous thoughts. As I round a corner, I find myself face to face with Sarah, my best friend, or former best friend, I suppose. We haven't spoken much since the incident. Megan? She says, surprise evident in her voice. How are you? I shrug, not meeting her eyes. I'm fine. An awkward silence stretches between us. Finally, Sarah speaks again, her voice hesitant. Look, Meg, I'm sorry about everything. I know you're going through a lot. Maybe we could get coffee sometime? Talk? For a moment, I'm tempted. I miss my old life, miss having friends who didn't look at me like I was crazy. But then I remember the disbelief in Sarah's eyes when I tried to tell her what really happened that night, and I feel my walls go up again. I don't think that's a good idea, I say coldly. You made it pretty clear you think I'm nuts. Sarah's face falls. Megan, that's not... But I'm already walking away, ignoring her calls. As I head back home, I feel a familiar heaviness settling over me. This is my life now, isolated, disbelieved, consumed by a truth that no one else can accept. Back in my room, I close the curtains against the bright morning sun and sink onto my bed. As I close my eyes, I can still smell the musky odor of the beast and feel its hot breath on my skin. The memory is so vivid, so real, that for a moment I'm back in that forest running for my life. I know the truth, even if no one else believes me. Bigfoot is real, and it's still out there, waiting in the shadows of the forest. And as long as I live, I'll never forget the terror of that night. the reality of what I saw. It's a burden I'll carry forever, a truth that sets me apart from everyone else. As I drift into an uneasy sleep, I can't shake the feeling that somehow, someday, I'll find a way to prove what I know. And maybe then, finally, I'll be free of the nightmare that has become my life. I never should have gone camping alone. That's what everyone tells me now, but hindsight is 20/20, right? My name is Greg Brown, and this is the story of how my life changed forever in the span of 36 hours. It all started on a crisp Friday afternoon in late September. I had just finished a grueling project at work, and I desperately needed to decompress. The Colorado wilderness had always been my sanctuary, a place where I could clear my head and reconnect with nature. Little did I know that this trip would turn into a nightmare that would haunt me for the rest of my life. As I loaded up my beat-up Ford Ranger with camping gear, my neighbor Tom called out from across the street. "Heading out for another adventure, Greg?" I nodded, forcing a smile. "Yeah, just a quick solo trip. Need to clear my head after that Johnson account." Tom frowned slightly. "Solo, huh? You sure that's a good idea? Those mountains can be unpredictable this time of year." I waved off his concern. "Don't worry, I've done this 100 times. I'll be back Sunday night, good as new." If only I had listened to Tom's unease. Maybe things would have turned out differently. The drive from Denver into the mountains was uneventful, but as I ventured deeper into the wilderness, an unsettling quiet settled over my truck. The usual chatter of the radio faded to static, and even the hum of the engine seemed muffled by the looming pines. I tried to shake off the growing sense of unease, chalking it up to work stress and too much caffeine. After a few hours of driving, I finally reached the trailhead that would lead to my favorite camping spot. As I parked and stepped out of the truck, the silence hit me like a physical force. No bird song, no rustling leaves, just an oppressive stillness that made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. "Get it together, Greg," I muttered to myself, shouldering my heavy backpack. "It's just the woods. You've done this a million times." But as I started down the overgrown path, I couldn't shake the feeling that unseen eyes were watching my every move. The dense forest seemed to close in around me, shadows reaching out with grasping fingers. Every step I took felt like I was venturing further into a world where I didn't belong. After about an hour of hiking, I finally reached the small clearing I had camped in many times before. It was perfect, a flat area near a babbling brook, surrounded by towering pines. But today, something felt off. The usual peace I felt in this spot was replaced by a gnawing anxiety. "This is ridiculous," I said aloud, my voice sounding unnaturally loud in the stillness. "It's just camping. Nothing to be afraid of." I busied myself with setting up camp, hoping the familiar routine would calm my nerves. As I hammered in the last tent stake, a twig snapped in the distance. I whirled around, my heart racing, but saw nothing but trees and shadows. Probably just a deer, I reasoned, but my voice lacked conviction. As the afternoon wore on, I tried to relax. I gathered firewood, filtered water from the stream, and even attempted some fishing, though the creek seemed eerily devoid of life. As dusk approached, I got a fire going and settled in with my dinner of dehydrated chili. That's when I heard it. A low, guttural sound that was definitely not a deer or any animal I recognized. It was distant, but unmistakable, and it sent a chill down my spine. "Hello?" I called out, immediately regretting it. Whatever made that sound was not something I wanted to attract. Silence fell again, but now it felt charged with potential energy, like the calm before a storm. I found myself straining to hear any other unusual noises, jumping at the slightest rustle of leaves. As full darkness descended, I reluctantly retreated to my tent. Sleep seemed impossible, every sound amplified by my fear. I lay there, fully clothed, my flashlight and pocket knife clutched in my hands like talismans against the unknown. Hours passed, or maybe it was minutes. Time seemed to stretch and warp in the oppressive darkness. Just as exhaustion began to overtake my fear, I heard it again. That same inhuman growl, but closer this time. Much closer. I held my breath, praying it was just my imagination. But then came the unmistakable sound of heavy footsteps crunching through the underbrush with deliberate slowness. Whatever it was big. Too big to be a normal forest animal. My mind raced through possibilities. Bear, mountain lion. But deep down, I knew it was something else entirely. Something that shouldn't exist. The footsteps circled my campsite, pausing occasionally as if studying my tent. I lay frozen, afraid that even the slightest movement would give me away. The stench hit me then. A horrific mix of wet fur, decay, and something unmistakably musky and animal. It was so strong it made my eyes water. Suddenly, the footsteps stopped right outside my tent. I could hear heavy breathing, feel the presence of something massive just inches away from me. My own breath came in short, silent gasps, tears of terror streaming down my face. A low, rumbling growl vibrated through the air, so close it seemed to rattle my bones. Then, as quickly as it had appeared, the presence moved away. The footsteps receded into the forest, leaving behind only that lingering, awful smell. I lay there for what felt like hours, too terrified to move, barely daring to breathe. Eventually, pure exhaustion took over, and I fell into a fitful sleep plagued by nightmares of glowing eyes and massive, shadowy figures. When I jolted awake in the pre-dawn darkness, my first thought was that it had all been a terrible dream. But the lingering stench and the trampled vegetation around my tent told a different story. Something had been here. Something big. As I unzipped my tent with trembling hands, I had no idea that I was about to come face to face with a nightmare made flesh. The true horror was just beginning, and my life would never be the same. The day dragged on interminably. Every rustle in the underbrush, every shadow that moved in the corner of my eye sent my heart racing. I couldn't shake the memory of that presence from the night before. The heavy footsteps, the inhuman growl, the overwhelming stench. Part of me wanted to pack up and leave right then, but a larger part was paralyzed with fear at the thought of venturing back through the forest. It was probably just a bear, I muttered to myself for the 100th time, trying to rationalize what I'd experienced. But deep down, I knew it wasn't true. Whatever had circled my tent last night was something else entirely. As the afternoon wore on, I forced myself to go through the motions of camping, gathering more firewood, filtering water, even attempting to fish in the eerily quiet stream. But my mind wasn't on these tasks. Instead, I found myself constantly scanning the tree line, jumping at every snapping twig or flutter of leaves. When dusk finally began to fall, I reluctantly set about making a campfire. The thought of facing another night here filled me with dread, but the alternative, hiking out through the darkening forest, seemed even worse. As I sat by the fire, picking at my dinner of trail mix and beef jerky, I couldn't help but feel like I was being watched. The flames cast flickering shadows that seemed to dance and reach towards me, and beyond the circle of firelight, the forest loomed dark and impenetrable. "Get a grip, Greg," I said aloud, my voice sounding thin and scared even to my own ears. "You're letting your imagination run wild." But as the words left my mouth, a twig snapped in the darkness beyond my campsite. I whirled around, my heart pounding, but saw nothing but shadows. "Hello?" I called out, immediately regretting it. "Is someone there?" Silence was my only answer, but it was a loaded silence, full of potential energy. I strained my ears, listening for any sign of movement, but heard nothing beyond the crackling of my fire. As the night deepened, my fear grew. The campfire's warmth couldn't dispel the growing sense of dread that settled over me. Every rustle in the underbrush made me jump, my imagination conjuring terrifying shapes in the shadows. I tried to distract myself by going over my work projects in my head, planning out the week ahead, anything to keep my mind off the oppressive darkness surrounding me. But it was no use. My thoughts kept circling back to the events of the previous night, to that massive presence that had stalked around my tent. Just as I was considering retreating to my tent, a sound froze me in place. It was low and guttural, A growl that was unmistakably real and definitely not from any animal I recognized. It seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once, reverberating through the clearing. "Oh God," I whispered, my body rigid with fear. "Oh God, oh God." I scanned the tree line frantically, my flashlight beam cutting through the darkness, but saw nothing. The growl came again, closer this time, and with it came that same overpowering stench I'd smelled the night before, a horrific mix of wet fur, decay, and musky animal odor. Without conscious thought, I scrambled to my feet and dove into my tent, zipping it up behind me as if the thin nylon could offer any protection against whatever was out there. I huddled in my sleeping bag, clutching my pocket knife in one hand and my flashlight in the other, straining my ears for any sound of approach. For what felt like hours, I lay there in terror, every sound amplified by my fear. The thing, whatever it was, seemed to be circling my campsite again, its heavy footsteps crunching through the underbrush. Occasionally it would pause, and in those moments of silence, I could hear its heavy breathing, so close it might as well have been inside the tent with me. Sleep was impossible. Even when the sounds of movement faded away, I remained alert, my body tense and ready for flight. My mind raced with possibilities, each more terrifying than the last. What was out there? Why was it stalking me? And most importantly, how was I going to survive until morning? As the night wore on, exhaustion began to take its toll. Despite my best efforts to stay awake, I found myself drifting off, only to jerk awake at the slightest sound. Each time I opened my eyes, I expected to see the tent walls torn away, to find myself face to face with some monstrous creature. It must have been close to dawn when I finally fell into a fitful sleep, my dreams filled with shadowy figures and glowing eyes. But even in sleep, I couldn't escape the terror. In my nightmares, I was running through an endless forest, always with the sense of something massive and relentless pursuing me. I jolted awake in the pre-dawn darkness, my heart pounding as I realized the heavy breathing I heard wasn't just in my dreams. It was real, and it was coming from just outside my tent. For a moment, I lay perfectly still, hardly daring to breathe. The sound was unmistakable, deep, rhythmic breaths, far too large to be from any normal forest animal, and with each exhale came that same horrific stench, seeping through the tent fabric. My hand tightened on the pocket knife, though I knew it would be useless against whatever was out there. My other hand fumbled for the flashlight, my fingers slick with sweat. As I lay there, paralyzed with fear, I heard a new sound. The slow, deliberate unzipping of my tent. Terror coursed through me as I realized that whatever was out there, it was intelligent enough to operate a zipper. This wasn't just some animal driven by instinct. This was something else entirely. With trembling hands, I raised the flashlight, my thumb on the switch. As the tent flap slowly opened, I knew I was about to come face to face with my stalker. In that moment, I wasn't sure which was worse, the fear of the unknown or the terror of finally seeing what had been haunting me. Taking a deep breath, I clicked on the flashlight, illuminating the tent opening. And there, framed in the entrance, was a sight that would haunt me for the rest of my life. A pair of glowing, inhuman eyes set in a face that was both eerily familiar and utterly alien. The encounter I had dreaded was about to begin, and I was woefully unprepared for the horror that awaited me. Time seemed to stand still as I stared into those glowing, inhuman eyes. My breath caught in my throat, and for a moment I forgot how to move, how to think, how to do anything but gaze in abject horror at the creature before me. The beam of my flashlight illuminated a face that defied description. It was both ape-like and disturbingly human, covered in thick, matted fur. The creature's massive silhouette blocked out the stars, its stench of wet fur and decay making me gag. This was no bear, no mountain lion. This was something straight out of a nightmare. "Oh God," I whimpered, my voice barely a whisper. "This can't be real." But it was real. Terrifyingly, undeniably real. The creature's lips pulled back in a snarl, revealing yellowed, pointed teeth. A low growl rumbled from its chest, vibrating the very air around us. I knew in that moment that I was face to face with a predator, and I was its prey. Adrenaline surged through my body, finally breaking the paralysis of fear. I scrambled backwards, my sleeping bag tangling around my legs as I tried to put distance between myself and the monster. "Stay back," I shouted, brandishing my pocket knife with a trembling hand. "Don't come any closer." My feeble threats seemed to amuse the creature. Its eyes narrowed, and with a speed that belied its massive size, it reached into the tent. The creature's enormous hand, more like a massive fur-covered claw, tore through my tent like tissue paper. I screamed then, a sound of pure terror that I didn't even recognize as my own voice. The shredded remains of my tent fell away, leaving me exposed to the pre-dawn chill and the looming presence of the beast. With another growl that seemed to shake the earth, the creature lunged forward. I felt its vice-like grip close around my ankle, the strength in those fingers inhuman. Before I could react, I was being dragged from what remained of my shelter. "No, let go," I yelled, clawing at the ground, desperate for any purchase. But it was useless. The creature's strength was overwhelming. In one fluid motion, the beast lifted me as if I weighed nothing. For a brief moment, I was eye to eye with the creature, close enough to see the intelligence behind those glowing orbs, to smell its fetid breath. Then, with a casual flick of its massive arm, it tossed me through the air. Pain exploded through my body as I slammed against a nearby tree. The impact knocked the wind out of me, and I crumpled to the ground, gasping for air. My vision swam, dark spots dancing at the edges, but I could still make out the hulking form of the creature advancing towards me. "Please," I wheezed, trying to crawl away. "Please don't." But the beast showed no sign of understanding or mercy. It reached for me again, its massive hand engulfing my entire upper arm. I felt bones grind as it squeezed, eliciting another scream of pain from me. In desperation, I lashed out with my pocket knife, the tiny blade seeming laughably inadequate against this monster. But luck was on my side. The knife found purchase, sinking into the creature's forearm. The beast roared in pain and fury, a sound so loud and primal, it seemed to shake the very trees around us. It released its grip on me, stumbling back a step as it examined the wound. I didn't waste the opportunity. Ignoring the searing pain in my body, I scrambled to my feet and ran. I had no plan, no destination in mind, just an overwhelming need to get away from the nightmare behind me. Branches whipped at my face as I crashed through the underbrush, my breath coming in ragged gasps. Behind me, I could hear the creature's enraged roars and the sound of splintering wood as it gave chase. I ran blindly through the pre-dawn forest, my only thought to put as much distance between myself and the monster as possible. But with each passing moment, the sound of pursuit grew closer. The creature's heavy footsteps thundered behind me, gaining ground with every stride. "Help!" I screamed, though I knew there was no one to hear me in this remote wilderness. "Somebody help me!" My foot caught on an exposed root, sending me sprawling to the forest floor. I tumbled down a small incline, leaves and twigs scratching at my skin. As I struggled to my feet, I realized with horror that I had run myself into a dead end. A steep cliff face loomed before me, too sheer to climb. I turned, my back pressed against the cold stone, as the creature burst into view. It paused at the edge of the small clearing, its massive chest heaving with exertion. Those glowing eyes fixed on me, and I saw something there that chilled me to my core. Not just hunger or rage, but a cruel intelligence. "Please," I begged, though I knew it was futile. "Please, just let me go." The creature's only response was another earth-shaking roar. It charged forward, covering the distance between us in 2 massive strides. I closed my eyes, certain that this was the end, but at the last moment survival instinct took over. I dove to the side, feeling the rush of air as the creature's massive arm swung where I had been standing a split second before. Its momentum carried it forward, and I heard the crunch of impact as it slammed into the cliff face. Rocks showered down and the creature stumbled, momentarily stunned. I didn't hesitate. I ran again, my legs burning with exertion, my lungs screaming for air. I had no idea where I was going, only that I had to get away. Behind me, I heard the creature's roar of frustration, followed by the sound of pursuit once more. But the blow seemed to have slowed it down, if only slightly. For the first time since this nightmare began, I felt a flicker of hope. Maybe, just maybe, I could outlast this monster. As I ran, the forest began to thin out. Ahead, I could see a break in the trees. My heart leapt. Maybe it was a road, or a ranger station. Maybe salvation was just ahead. But as I burst out of the tree line, my hope turned to despair. I found myself on the edge of a steep ravine, a sheer drop into darkness before me. The sound of the creature crashing through the underbrush grew louder, closer. I was trapped between certain death at the hands of the monster and a desperate leap into the unknown. Time seemed to slow as I stood on the precipice, the weight of the decision pressing down on me. The creature burst from the tree line, its eyes locked on me, its intentions clear. In that moment, my decision was made for me. With the creature's roar echoing in my ears, I turned and leapt into the darkness of the ravine. As I fell, I had no idea if I would survive the impact. But I knew that whatever awaited me at the bottom of this cliff, it couldn't be worse than the fate I was leaving behind. The last thing I remember is the sensation of falling, the creature's furious roars fading above me, and then darkness. I don't know how long I was unconscious. When I came to, the world was a haze of pain and confusion. Every inch of my body screamed in agony, and for a moment, I couldn't remember where I was or what had happened. Then it all came rushing back. The creature, the chase, the desperate leap into the ravine. I was alive somehow. The fall hadn't killed me, though it felt like it had come close. I lay there at the bottom of the ravine, trying to catch my breath and assess the damage. My clothes were torn and bloody, and I could feel a warm trickle running down the side of my face. But I could move, and nothing seemed to be broken, at least, not severely. As my senses slowly returned, I became aware of a sound that made my blood run cold. From somewhere above, echoing off the ravine walls, came the creature's howls. It was still up there, still hunting me. Adrenaline surged through my battered body once more. I knew I couldn't stay here. If that thing found a way down, I'd be trapped with nowhere to run. With a groan of pain, I forced myself to my feet, using a broken branch as a makeshift crutch. "Come on, Greg," I muttered to myself, my voice hoarse and barely recognizable. "You've got to keep moving." I started limping through the pre-dawn forest, each step sending jolts of pain through my body. I had no idea where I was or which direction would lead me to safety. All I knew was that I had to put as much distance between myself and that monster as possible. The creature's howls continued, sometimes seeming to fade, only to come roaring back with renewed intensity. It was as if it was pacing along the top of the ravine, searching for a way down. The thought spurred me on, pushing me to move faster despite the protests of my battered body. As I stumbled through the unfamiliar terrain, I tried to make sense of what was happening. This couldn't be real, could it? Bigfoot wasn't supposed to exist, let alone be a vicious, intelligent predator. But the pain in my body and the terror in my heart told me this was no dream or hallucination. "Help," I called out weakly, though I knew it was futile. "Is anyone out there?" Only the echo of my own voice and the distant howls of the creature answered me. I was alone in this nightmare, with no one coming to my rescue. The sun began to rise, painting the sky in hues of pink and orange. Under different circumstances, it might have been beautiful. But now it only filled me with dread. Daylight meant the creature would have an easier time tracking me. I pushed on, my makeshift crutch sinking into the soft forest floor with each step. My mouth was dry, my stomach empty, and every muscle in my body screamed for rest. But the memory of those glowing eyes and yellowed teeth kept me moving. As the morning wore on, I began to realize the true extent of my predicament. I was hopelessly lost, my supplies left behind at the destroyed campsite. I had no food, no water, no way to call for help. And somewhere out there, that thing was still hunting me. "Think, Greg," I said aloud, my voice cracking. "You've got to find a way out of this." But every option seemed impossible. I couldn't go back the way I came. That would lead me straight to the creature. I had no idea which direction might lead to civilization, and in my current state, I doubted I could survive more than a day or two in the wilderness. The sound of running water caught my attention. I changed course, limping towards the noise. After what felt like hours, I came upon a small stream. The sight of it nearly brought me to tears. I collapsed at the water's edge, cupping the cool liquid in my hands and drinking greedily. As I sat there, trying to gather my strength, a twig snapped in the forest behind me. I froze, my heart pounding. Slowly, I turned my head, dreading what I might see. There, partially obscured by the trees, stood the creature. It was even more terrifying in the daylight, over 8 feet tall, covered in matted brown fur with hands that looked capable of crushing stone. Its eyes, no longer glowing but still filled with predatory intelligence, were fixed on me. For a moment, we stared at each other, neither moving. Then, with a roar that seemed to shake the very ground, it charged. I scrambled to my feet, ignoring the screaming pain in my body, and ran. Branches whipped my face as I crashed through the underbrush, my only thought to escape the nightmare pursuing me. I could hear the creature's heavy footsteps behind me, growing closer with each passing second. Its hot breath seemed to be on the back of my neck, spurring me to push my body beyond its limits. "No, no, no," I gasped, tears streaming down my face as I ran. "Please, God, no." I burst into a clearing, my lungs burning, my vision blurring. Ahead, I could see another steep drop. Not as sheer as the ravine, but still dangerous. Behind me, the creature's footsteps thundered ever closer. There was no time to think, no time to consider options. With the creature's roar echoing in my ears, I threw myself forward, tumbling down the steep incline. I rolled and bounced down the slope, rocks and branches tearing at my skin. When I finally came to a stop at the bottom, every part of me was in agony. But I was alive, and for the moment, out of the creature's reach. I looked up the slope, expecting to see the monster barreling down after me, but it had stopped at the top, pacing back and forth, its eyes never leaving me. It seemed reluctant to attempt the steep descent. For a brief moment, I allowed myself to feel a flicker of hope. Maybe I had found the one thing the creature wouldn't do, the one obstacle it couldn't overcome. But as I watched, the beast began to move along the ridge, clearly searching for an easier way down. The respite would be temporary. With a groan of pain, I forced myself to my feet once more. I was battered, exhausted, and terrified beyond anything I'd ever experienced. But I was still alive, and as long as I was breathing, I would keep fighting to survive. As I limped away from the slope, seeking any kind of shelter or escape, I knew the chase was far from over. The creature was still out there, still hunting me. And as the sun climbed higher in the sky, I realized that my chances of surviving another encounter were growing slimmer by the minute. The forest stretched endlessly before me, full of unknown dangers. But I had no choice but to press on. Somewhere out there had to be safety, had to be escape from this nightmare. I just had to stay alive long enough to find it. With one last look over my shoulder at the ridge where the creature still prowled, I stumbled forward into the unknown, praying that somehow, someway, I would make it out of this alive. I don't know how long I stumbled through the forest after my tumble down the slope. Time seemed to lose all meaning as I pushed my battered body forward, driven by pure survival instinct. Every step was agony, my muscles screaming in protest, but the memory of those inhuman eyes kept me moving. As the adrenaline began to wear off, the full extent of my injuries became apparent. My clothes were in tatters, barely hanging onto my bruised and bloodied body. I could feel a warm trickle of blood running down the side of my face from a gash on my forehead. My left ankle throbbed with each step, likely sprained from the fall. I paused, leaning heavily against a tree to catch my breath. The forest was quiet, too quiet. No birdsong, no rustling of small animals. It was as if the entire woodland knew there was a predator on the loose. "Get it together, Greg," I muttered to myself, my voice hoarse, and barely recognizable. You've got to find a way out of this. But as I looked around at the endless expanse of trees, despair began to creep in. I was hopelessly lost, with no supplies, no water, and no idea which direction might lead to safety. And somewhere out there, that thing was still hunting me. I forced myself to keep moving, using a broken branch as a makeshift crutch. Each step sent jolts of pain through my body, but I knew staying still wasn't an option. I had to find water, shelter, something to give me a fighting chance. As the sun climbed higher in the sky, the heat became oppressive. Sweat mingled with blood, stinging my eyes and attracting swarms of insects. My throat was parched, my lips cracked and bleeding. Dehydration was becoming a real threat. Water, I croaked, scanning the forest floor for any sign of moisture. There's got to be water somewhere. Just when I thought I couldn't take another step, I heard it, the faint sound of running water. Hope surged through me, giving me a second wind. I changed direction, limping towards the noise as fast as my battered body would allow. After what felt like hours, I stumbled upon a small stream. The sight of it nearly brought me to tears. I collapsed at the water's edge, cupping the cool liquid in my hands and drinking greedily. It was probably full of bacteria, but at that moment I didn't care. It was the sweetest thing I'd ever tasted. As I sat there trying to gather my strength, a twig snapped in the forest behind me. I froze, my heart pounding. Slowly I turned my head, dreading what I might see. But there was nothing there, just trees and shadows. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. The creature's howls, though distant, still echoed through the forest occasionally, a chilling reminder that I wasn't safe yet. I knew I couldn't stay by the stream for long. It was too exposed, and the creature might be using it to track me. With a groan of pain, I forced myself to my feet once more. "Okay, think," I said aloud, trying to focus my scattered thoughts. "You need shelter, somewhere to hide, to rest." I scanned the area, looking for anything that might offer protection. That's when I spotted it. A large fallen tree, its massive trunk creating a natural hollow. It wasn't much, but it was the best option I had. Gathering what little strength I had left, I limped towards the fallen giant. The hollow was just big enough for me to squeeze into, offering some protection from the elements and, hopefully, from prying eyes. As I settled into my makeshift shelter, exhaustion hit me like a physical force. I knew I should try to stay awake, to keep watch, but my body had other ideas. Despite my best efforts, my eyelids began to droop. Just a few minutes," I murmured, already half asleep. "Got to stay alert." I don't know how long I slept. When I jerked awake, the forest was bathed in the golden light of late afternoon. For a moment I was disoriented, unsure of where I was or what had happened. Then it all came rushing back, the creature, the chase, the desperate fight for survival. I held my breath, listening intently for any sign of the monster. But the forest was quiet, almost peaceful. Had I lost it? Or was it just biding its time, waiting for the perfect moment to strike? As the initial panic subsided, I became aware of a new problem. My stomach growled loudly, reminding me that I hadn't eaten since... Was it yesterday? The day before? Time had become a blur. "Food," I muttered, crawling out of my hiding spot. "Got to find something to eat." I knew the basics of wilderness survival, which plants were edible, how to set simple traps. But in my current state, with no tools and limited mobility, my options were severely limited. I managed to find a few berries that I recognized as safe to eat, but it was hardly enough to quell the gnawing hunger in my stomach. As I searched for more, my thoughts turned dark. How long could I survive out here? Days? Weeks? And would I even last that long with that creature hunting me? The sun was setting now, painting the sky in hues of orange and purple. Under different circumstances, it might have been beautiful. But now it filled me with dread. Night was coming, and with it, the increased danger of another encounter with the beast. I made my way back to the fallen tree, my movements slow and painful. Every rustle in the underbrush, every shadow that moved in the fading light, sent my heart racing. I felt like prey, constantly on edge, waiting for the predator to strike. As I squeezed back into my hiding spot, a bone-chilling howl echoed through the forest. It was closer now, much closer than before. The creature was on the move, and it was heading in my direction. No, 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 I whimpered, pressing myself as far back into the hollow as I could. Please, just go away. But the howls continued, growing louder with each passing minute. I could hear the sound of branches breaking, of heavy footsteps moving through the forest. It was coming, and there was nowhere for me to run. As night fell, I huddled in the hollow of the fallen tree, too exhausted to run, silently praying for rescue. But I knew the truth. No one was coming. No one even knew I was missing yet. I was alone in this nightmare, with only my wits and my will to survive standing between me and certain death. The forest grew dark around me, the shadows seeming to reach out with grasping fingers. And somewhere out there in the blackness, a monster was hunting me. As I lay there, trembling with fear and exhaustion, I knew that the long night ahead would either see my survival or my demise. The night seemed to stretch on forever. Every sound, every rustle of leaves or snap of a twig sent my heart racing. I lay there in the hollow of the fallen tree, my body aching and my mind reeling from the events of the past day. Sleep was impossible, even if I could have relaxed enough to doze off. The fear of what might happen if I let my guard down kept me wide awake. As the hours crawled by, I found myself drifting in and out of a sort of waking nightmare. Images of the creature's glowing eyes and massive, fur-covered form haunted me. I kept replaying the chase in my mind, wondering if there was anything I could have done differently, any way I could have avoided this nightmare. Just when I thought the night couldn't get any worse, I heard it, the snapping of branches much closer than before. My blood turned to ice as I realized the sound was coming from just outside my hiding place. "Please no," I whispered, my voice barely audible even to my own ears. "Please just go away." But my pleas went unanswered. The snapping grew louder, accompanied by heavy footsteps that seemed to shake the very ground. And then, illuminated by the moonlight filtering through the trees, I saw it. The creature's massive form appeared at the entrance of my hollow, its eyes gleaming with predatory intelligence. I bit back a scream, knowing that any sound might provoke it to attack. For a moment, we were locked in a silent standoff, its foul breath washing over me in waves. Then, with a speed that belied its enormous size, it reached into the hollow. I felt its vice-like grip close around my leg, its strength inhuman and terrifying. Before I could react, it was dragging me out of my hiding place as if I weighed nothing. "No!" I screamed, my fingers clawing at the ground, desperate for any purchase. "Let go of me." But my struggles were useless against its overwhelming strength. In seconds, I was out in the open, face to face with the monster that had been haunting me. Up close, it was even more terrifying than I remembered. Its massive body was covered in thick, matted fur, and its face was a nightmarish blend of ape and human features. The creature lifted me effortlessly, bringing me to eye level. Its breath was hot on my face, reeking of decay and raw meat. I could see the intelligence in its eyes, the cruel calculation as it regarded its prey. "Please," I whimpered, my voice shaking with terror. "I don't want to die." For a brief moment, I thought I saw something flicker in the creature's eyes. Not compassion exactly, but perhaps a glimmer of understanding. But then it was gone, replaced by a cold, predatory gleam. With a primal roar that shook me to my core, the creature tossed me through the air as if I were a rag doll. I slammed into a nearby tree, the impact knocking the wind out of me. Stars exploded in my vision as I crumpled to the ground, gasping for air. Dazed and in agony, I tried to crawl away, but my battered body wouldn't cooperate. The creature advanced on me, its massive form blocking out the moonlight. I knew with a sickening certainty that this was it. I was about to die, alone in the wilderness, at the hands of a monster that shouldn't even exist. Just as the creature reached for me again, A distant sound pierced the night. A siren, faint but unmistakable. The monster hesitated, its head swiveling towards the noise. It was the opening I needed. Summoning strength I didn't know I had, I scrambled to my feet and ran. My body screamed in protest with every step, but the adrenaline coursing through my veins pushed me forward. Behind me, I could hear the creature's roar of frustration, followed by the sound of pursuit. I crashed through the underbrush, branches whipping my face and tearing at my already battered body. The siren grew louder as I ran, giving me a direction to aim for. It was my only hope of survival. "Help!" I screamed as I ran, my voice hoarse and barely audible over the pounding of my heart. "Somebody help me!" The creature's footsteps thundered behind me, growing closer with each passing second. I could feel its hot breath on the back of my neck, spurring me to push my body beyond its limits. Just when I thought I couldn't run another step, I burst through a line of trees and found myself on the edge of a road. The flashing lights of a police car illuminated the night, momentarily blinding me. I stumbled towards it, waving my arms frantically. "Help!" I croaked, my voice barely more than a whisper now. "Please, help me!" The officer, who had been dealing with what looked like a broken-down car, turned towards me in surprise. His eyes widened as he took in my battered appearance. "Sir, are you all right?" he called out, reaching for his radio. I opened my mouth to respond, to warn him about the creature, but no words came out. The world began to spin around me as the adrenaline faded, and the full extent of my injuries made themselves known. The last thing I saw before darkness claimed me was the officer running towards me, his face a mask of concern. As I slipped into unconsciousness, a small part of me wondered if I had truly escaped, or if this was just a cruel trick of my mind, giving me false hope before the end. The creature's roar echoed in my ears, a chilling reminder that the nightmare might not be over yet. My last conscious thought was a desperate prayer that when I woke up, if I woke up, I would be far away from this forest and the monster that lurked within it. But even as I faded away, I knew that no matter how far I ran, the memory of those glowing eyes and that inhuman strength would haunt me forever. I drifted in and out of consciousness, fragments of reality blending with nightmarish visions. The creature's roar echoed in my mind, mingling with the wail of sirens and urgent voices. I couldn't tell what was real and what was a product of my traumatized brain. When I finally came to, I found myself in a stark white room that smelled of antiseptic. A hospital. For a moment, relief washed over me. I was safe, away from the forest, away from that monster. But as the fog of unconsciousness lifted, the terror came rushing back. "He's awake," a voice said, and a nurse appeared in my field of vision. "Sir, can you hear me? Do you know where you are?" I tried to speak, but my throat was raw and painful. I managed a weak nod instead. "You're at Mercy General Hospital," the nurse explained gently. "You've been unconscious for several hours. A police officer found you on the road near Elkhorn Forest. Do you remember what happened?" The memories flooded back. The creature, the chase, the desperate fight for survival. I opened my mouth to tell her everything but hesitated. Would anyone believe me? I was attacked, I croaked, my voice barely above a whisper. The nurse nodded sympathetically. "The doctor will be here soon to check on you. Try to rest for now." As she left, I took stock of my condition. My body was a patchwork of bandages and bruises. An IV drip was attached to my arm, and various monitors beeped steadily beside the bed. I felt like I'd been hit by a truck, which I supposed wasn't far from the truth given the strength of that creature. A short while later, a doctor entered the room, followed by two men in police uniforms. "Mr. Brown?" The doctor greeted me, consulting a chart. "I'm Dr. Patel. How are you feeling?" "Like hell," I managed to rasp out. He nodded, unsurprised. "You've suffered multiple lacerations, contusions, and a mild concussion. You're also severely dehydrated and showing signs of extreme stress. Can you tell us what happened?" I looked at the police officers, then back at the doctor. How could I explain what I'd been through? Who would believe me? I was camping in Elkhorn Forest. I began hesitantly. Something attacked me. Something big. One of the officers stepped forward. I'm Officer Martinez, and this is my partner, Officer Chen. We found you on Route 16 last night. You were in pretty bad shape. Can you describe what attacked you? I took a deep breath, wincing at the pain in my ribs. You're not going to believe me. Try us, Officer Chen said, his expression neutral. It was Bigfoot, I said, the words tumbling out. I know how it sounds, but I swear it's true. It was huge, covered in fur with these glowing eyes. It chased me through the forest, tried to kill me. The room fell silent. I could see the skepticism in their eyes, the shared glances that said they thought I was crazy or delirious. Dr. Patel cleared his throat. Mr. Brown, you've been through a traumatic experience. It's not uncommon for the mind to create explanations or images to cope with extreme stress. No, you don't understand, I insisted, my voice rising. It was real. I saw it. I felt it. It threw me against a tree like I was nothing. Officer Martinez stepped in, his voice calm but firm. Sir, we searched the area where we found you. We didn't find any evidence of a large animal attack, no tracks, no fur, nothing. But I started to protest, but Officer Chen cut me off. We did find your campsite, he said. It was in pretty bad shape. Looks like you might have had a run-in with a bear. That would explain your injuries. I shook my head vehemently, ignoring the pain the movement caused. It wasn't a bear. I know what I saw. You have to believe me. Dr. Patel placed a hand on my shoulder, his touch meant to be reassuring but feeling patronizing. Mr. Brown, you're safe now. We're going to take good care of you, but right now what you need is rest. I wanted to argue more, to make them understand, but exhaustion was creeping over me again. The doctor adjusted something on my IV, and I felt a wave of drowsiness wash over me. We'll talk more when you're feeling better, Officer Martinez said as my eyelids grew heavy. Try to get some sleep. As I drifted off, I could hear them talking in low voices. Poor guy, one of them said. Must have been one hell of a bear to scare him that badly. Or one hell of a nightmare, another replied. I wanted to scream at them, to make them understand that it wasn't a bear or a nightmare. It was real, all of it. But the darkness was pulling me under and I was powerless to resist. When I woke again, sunlight was streaming through the window. A different nurse was checking my vitals. Good morning, Mr. Brown, she said cheerfully. How are you feeling today? Better, I admitted, though my body still ached all over. When can I go home? The doctor wants to keep you for observation for another day or two, she replied. You had quite an ordeal out there. I nodded, not trusting myself to speak. The memory of the creature was still vivid in my mind, but so was the disbelief I'd faced when trying to explain what happened. Throughout the day, various doctors and nurses came to check on me. They were all kind and professional, but I could see the doubt in their eyes when they looked at me. To them, I was just another patient who'd had an accident in the woods, nothing more. In the afternoon, a man in a suit arrived, introducing himself as a park ranger. Mr. Brown, he said, pulling up a chair next to my bed. I'm Ranger Thompson. I was hoping we could talk about what happened in Elkhorn Forest. I eyed him warily. Are you going to tell me it was a bear too? He smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. I'm here to listen, Mr. Brown. Why don't you tell me what you remember? So I did. I told him everything. The creature's appearance, the chase through the forest, the terrifying strength it possessed. As I spoke, I searched his face for any sign of belief, but his expression remained carefully neutral. When I finished, he was quiet for a long moment. That's quite a story, Mr. Brown, he said finally. It's not a story, I insisted. It's what happened. I know it sounds crazy, but... He held up a hand to stop me. I've worked these forests for 20 years, Mr. Brown. I've heard a lot of stories. but I've never seen any evidence of a creature like the one you're describing. But what I have seen, he continued, are the effects of fear and isolation on the human mind. The forest can play tricks on you, especially at night. I slumped back against my pillows, defeated. You think I'm crazy? Ranger Thompson stood, his expression softening slightly. I think you've been through a traumatic experience, my advice. Go home, rest, and try to put this behind you. As he left, I felt a wave of despair wash over me. No one believed me. No one would ever believe me. I was alone with the memory of what had happened, with no way to prove it was real. As night fell, I lay awake in my hospital bed, replaying the events in my mind. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the creature's glowing eyes, felt its hot breath on my face. I knew with a sickening certainty that even though I had escaped the forest, I would never truly escape the memory of what had happened there. And somewhere out in those dark woods, the creature was still out there, waiting for its next victim. The thought sent a chill down my spine, and I knew that sleep would be a long time coming. The next morning, I woke up with a desperate need to prove that what I had experienced was real. Despite the doctor's advice to rest, I couldn't shake the feeling that every moment I spent in this hospital bed was another moment for the evidence to disappear. When Dr. Patel came for his morning rounds, I was already sitting up, my mind made up. Mr. Brown, how are you feeling today? He asked, checking my vitals. I need to leave, I said firmly. I need to go back to the forest. Dr. Patel frowned. Mr. Brown, I strongly advise against that. Your body needs time to heal, and the psychological trauma. I'm not crazy, I interrupted, my voice rising. I know what I saw, what I experienced, and I need to prove it. The doctor sighed, clearly conflicted. I can't force you to stay, but I must emphasize how unwise this is. At least let me check you over one more time. After a thorough examination and a lot of paperwork, I was finally cleared to leave against medical advice. As I changed into the clothes a nurse had brought from the lost and found, I overheard Dr. Patel talking to someone outside my room, clearly still in shock. Keep an eye on him, but don't agitate him further. I gritted my teeth, frustrated by their continued disbelief, but I was determined to change that. As I left the hospital, I was met by Officer Martinez, who had apparently been assigned to follow up on my case. Mr. Brown, he greeted me, his expression a mix of concern and skepticism. I heard you're checking out. Where are you headed? Back to Elkhorn Forest, I said firmly. I need to show you what really happened. Martinez looked uncomfortable. Sir, I don't think that's a good idea. You've been through a traumatic experience. I'm not delusional, I snapped. Look, you want to know what really happened, right? Then come with me. Let me show you. After a moment of hesitation, Martinez nodded. All right, Mr. Brown, but we do this by the book. I'll drive, and we stay together at all times. Deal? I agreed, relieved that at least someone was willing to hear me out. The drive back to Elkhorn Forest was tense. Every mile closer made my heart race faster, memories of the creature flashing through my mind. But I pushed down the fear, focusing on my mission to find proof. As we pulled up to the forest ranger station, I saw Ranger Thompson waiting for us. His expression was grim as we approached. Officer Martinez called ahead. He explained. Mr. Brown, I want to be clear. We're humoring you against our better judgment. We'll take a quick look around your campsite, but at the first sign of trouble, we're leaving. Understood? I nodded, too focused on the task ahead to argue. We set off into the forest, with Thompson leading the way. Every rustle in the undergrowth, every snapping twig made me flinch, expecting to see the creature's massive form emerge from the trees. But the forest remained quiet, almost mockingly so. After about an hour of hiking, we reached the clearing where my campsite had been. My heart sank as I took in the scene. The area was undisturbed, with no sign of the violent encounter I had experienced. This can't be right, I muttered, frantically scanning the area. It was right here. My tent was torn to shreds. There were footprints, broken branches. Martinez and Thompson exchanged a look that spoke volumes about their skepticism. "Mr. Brown," Thompson said gently, "are you sure this is the right spot? There's no sign of any disturbance here." "No, no, no," I insisted, my voice rising with panic. "It was here, I swear it. The creature, it threw me against that tree over there. Look." I rushed over to the tree I remembered slamming into, searching for any sign of impact. But the bark was unmarked, the ground around it undisturbed. "This is impossible," I whispered, my mind reeling. It was real. I felt it, I saw it. Martinez approached me cautiously. "Mr. Brown, I think we should head back now. You're clearly upset." "I'm not crazy," I shouted, my frustration boiling over. "It was here. The creature was real." As if in response to my outburst, a distant roar echoed through the forest. We all froze, listening intently. "What was that?" I asked, my voice shaking. Thompson shrugged, though he looked uneasy. "Probably just a bear. They're common in this area." "That wasn't a bear," I insisted. "That was it, the creature. We have to go investigate." But Martinez was already shaking his head. "No way, Mr. Brown. We're leaving now. This was a bad idea." As they began to lead me back towards the ranger station, I couldn't help but look back over my shoulder. For a split second, I thought I saw something move in the shadows of the trees, a large, dark shape that disappeared as quickly as it had appeared. "Wait," I called out. "I saw something, just over there." Thompson sighed. "Mr. Brown, there's nothing there. It's just shadows and your imagination." But I knew what I had seen. As we hiked back, my mind raced. The creature was real. I was sure of it. But why wasn't there any evidence? How could it have cleaned up the campsite so thoroughly? By the time we reached the ranger station, I was no closer to answers. Martinez and Thompson were clearly relieved to be back, eager to be done with what they saw as a wild goose chase. "Mr. Brown," Martinez said as we prepared to leave, "I know this isn't what you wanted to hear, but there's no evidence to support your story. I think it's time you went home and tried to put this behind you." I nodded numbly, too exhausted and disheartened to argue further. But as we drove away from Elkhorn Forest, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. I glanced in the side mirror, and for a brief moment, I swore I saw a pair of glowing eyes in the tree line. By the time we reached my home, night had fallen. Martinez dropped me off with a final word of advice to seek counseling. But as I stood on my front porch, watching his car disappear down the street, I knew this wasn't over. The creature was real. I had no proof, no way to make anyone believe me, but I knew what I had experienced. And as I entered my empty house, still bearing the scrapes and bruises from my ordeal, I realized that this knowledge would haunt me far more than any physical wounds ever could. I locked the door behind me, but I knew it was a futile gesture. No lock could keep out the memories of what I had seen, what I had survived. And somewhere out there, in the dark forest of Colorado, the creature was still waiting, still hunting. As I settled in for what I knew would be a sleepless night, I couldn't help but wonder, would anyone ever believe me? And more importantly, would anyone else fall victim to the monster that lurked in Elkhorn Forest? The first rays of dawn were creeping through my windows when I finally gave up on sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw those glowing, inhuman orbs staring back at me. The creature's roar echoed in my ears, drowning out the peaceful morning bird song outside. I dragged myself to the bathroom, wincing at my reflection in the mirror. The man staring back at me looked like a stranger, pale, haggard, with dark circles under his eyes and a wild, haunted look. The bruises and cuts from my ordeal stood out starkly against my skin, a painful reminder that it hadn't all been a nightmare. As I splashed cold water on my face, trying to shake off the fog of exhaustion, my phone buzzed. It was a text from my boss, asking where I was and if I was coming in today. I had completely forgotten about work, about the normal world that continued to spin while my life had been turned upside down. With trembling fingers, I called the office, "Greg, where are you?" My boss, Sarah, answered. "The Johnson account presentation is in an hour." I can't come in," I stammered. "There was an accident. I was in the hospital." There was a pause on the other end. "Oh my God, are you okay? What happened?" I opened my mouth to explain, then closed it again. How could I possibly tell her the truth? "I had an accident while camping," I said finally. "Got pretty banged up. I need a few days to recover." Sarah's voice softened with concern. "Of course, take all the time you need. Do you want me to send someone over? Do you need anything?" "No," I said too quickly. "No, I'm fine. Just need some rest. Thanks, Sarah." I hung up before she could ask any more questions. The idea of facing anyone right now, of trying to explain what had happened, made me feel physically ill. As the morning wore on, my phone kept buzzing with messages from concerned coworkers and friends who had heard about my accident. Each one felt like an accusation, a reminder of the normal life I had lost. Around noon, there was a knock at my door. My heart leapt into my throat, irrational fear telling me it was the creature, come to finish what it had started. But when I peered through the peephole, I saw my neighbor, Tom. I opened the door a crack, not wanting him to see the state I was in. "Greg, I heard you were in an accident," Tom said, his face creased with worry. "Are you okay? What happened?" "I'm fine," I lied, my voice hoarse. "Just a camping mishap. Nothing to worry about." Tom frowned, clearly not buying it. "You don't look fine, Greg. Let me come in. I can help." "No," I said, more forcefully than I intended. "I mean, thanks, but I just need to rest. I'll be okay." I closed the door before he could protest further, leaning against it and sliding to the floor. The concern in Tom's eyes, the normalcy he represented, it was all too much. As the day wore on, I found myself obsessively checking news sites and local forums, searching for any reports of strange sightings or unexplained incidents in Elkhorn Forest. But there was nothing. No missing hikers. No unusual animal attacks. It was as if the creature existed only in my mind. In a fit of desperation, I even tried calling the local news station. "KDRV News, how can I direct your call?" A cheerful voice answered. I need to report something," I said, my voice shaking. "Something important." "Okay, sir. What would you like to report?" I took a deep breath. "There's a creature in Elkhorn Forest. It's dangerous. People need to be warned." "Sir," the receptionist cut me off, her voice losing its cheerful edge. "If this is a prank call—" "It's not a prank," I insisted. "I saw it. It attacked me. You have to believe me." But the line had already gone dead. I stared at the phone in disbelief, then hurled it across the room in frustration. As evening approached, I found myself pacing my living room, unable to sit still. The walls seemed to be closing in on me, and every shadow held the potential for danger. I knew I was being irrational, that the creature couldn't possibly be here in my home, but logic had no hold over the primal fear that had taken root in my mind. In a desperate attempt to prove to myself that I wasn't crazy, I turned on my computer and started researching Bigfoot sightings. Page after page of blurry photos and secondhand accounts filled my screen. Some seemed credible, others were obvious hoaxes, but none of them captured the true horror of what I had experienced. Hours passed as I fell deeper into the rabbit hole of cryptozoology forums and conspiracy theory websites. The rational part of my mind knew this wasn't healthy, that I was only feeding my paranoia. But I couldn't stop. I needed to find others who would believe me, who had seen what I had seen. It was well past midnight when I finally tore myself away from the computer. My eyes were burning, my head pounding, but sleep still felt impossible. Every time I closed my eyes, I was back in that forest running for my life. I stumbled to the kitchen, hoping a glass of water might help clear my head. As I stood at the sink, I glanced out the window into my backyard. And for a heart-stopping moment, I swore I saw a large dark figure standing at the edge of the woods behind my house. I blinked, and it was gone. Just a trick of the shadows, I told myself. It had to be. but I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched, of being hunted. As I made my way back to the living room, my gaze fell on the phone I had thrown earlier. It lay on the floor, its screen cracked but still functional. An idea began to form in my mind, a way to make people believe me, to warn them of the danger lurking in Elkhorn Forest. With shaking hands, I picked up the phone and opened my email. I began to type, pouring out my story in all its terrifying detail. I knew how it would sound, knew that most people would dismiss it as the ravings of a madman. But if even one person believed me, if one potential victim was saved from the fate I had narrowly escaped, it would be worth it. As I hit send on the email, addressed to every news outlet and government agency I could think of, I felt a strange mix of relief and dread. I had done what I could to warn people, to share the truth of what I had experienced. But I also knew that this action might well be the final nail in the coffin of my credibility, my sanity in the eyes of the world. I sank onto my couch, exhaustion finally overtaking me. As I drifted off into an uneasy sleep, one thought echoed in my mind. The creature was still out there, waiting, and I was the only one who knew the truth. The harsh light of dawn filtered through my living room curtains, rousing me from a fitful sleep plagued by nightmares. For a brief, blissful moment, I forgot where I was and what had happened. Then reality came crashing back, and the weight of my experience settled over me like a suffocating blanket. I sat up on the couch, wincing at the stiffness in my battered body. The events of the past 48 hours felt like a lifetime ago, yet the terror was still fresh, raw, and all-consuming. I glanced at my phone, dreading what I might find after my late-night email frenzy. As expected, my inbox was flooded. Most were automated responses, a few were polite dismissals, and some were downright hostile. I scrolled through them, my heart sinking with each message. Mr. Brown, while we appreciate your concern, we do not report on unsubstantiated claims. Dear sir, please seek professional help. If this is a prank, it's not funny. Do not contact us again. I tossed the phone aside, a mix of frustration and despair washing over me. No one believed me. No one would ever believe me. As I stumbled to the kitchen to make coffee, my gaze was drawn to the window overlooking my backyard. The trees at the edge of my property seemed to loom closer than I remembered, their shadows stretching towards the house like grasping fingers. I shuddered, remembering the figure I thought I'd seen last night. Get a grip, Greg, I muttered to myself, turning away from the window. You're home. You're safe. But even as I said the words, I knew they weren't true. How could I ever feel safe again, knowing what was out there? The day crawled by in a haze of anxiety and paranoia. Every unexpected sound made me jump. Every shadow seemed to hide a potential threat. I found myself constantly checking and rechecking the locks on my doors and windows, as if a simple deadbolt could keep out the nightmare I'd experienced. In the afternoon, my doorbell rang, sending my heart racing. I approached cautiously, peering through the peephole. It was Sarah, my boss, holding what looked like a get-well basket. I opened the door a crack, not wanting her to see the state of my house, or more importantly, the state I was in. "Greg," Sarah exclaimed, her eyes widening as she took in my appearance. "My God, what happened to you?" I realized too late that I probably looked even worse than I had yesterday. "I told you, camping accident," I mumbled, not meeting her eyes. Sarah's brow furrowed with concern. "This looks like more than just a fall, Greg. Are you sure you don't need to go back to the hospital?" "I'm fine," I insisted, perhaps a bit too forcefully. "Really, Sarah, I just need some time to recover." She didn't look convinced, but didn't push the issue. "Well, I brought you some things. Soup, magazines, get well stuff." She held out the basket. I took it reluctantly, knowing I was being rude but unable to muster the energy for social niceties. "Thanks. I appreciate it." As I started to close the door, Sarah put her hand out to stop me. "Greg, you know you can talk to me if something's wrong, right? If you need help." For a moment, I was tempted to tell her everything, to pour out the whole terrifying story and beg her to believe me. but the memory of all those dismissive emails stopped me. "I'm okay, Sarah. Really. I'll be back at work soon." I closed the door before she could say anything else, leaning against it and sliding to the floor, the get-well basket forgotten beside me. The concern in Sarah's eyes, the normality she represented, it all felt like it belonged to another world, one I could no longer be part of. As evening fell, I found myself drawn back to the window, staring out at the deepening shadows in my backyard. The trees seemed to sway in a non-existent breeze, their branches reaching towards my house. And there, just at the edge of the woods, I saw it. A large, dark shape that didn't belong. My heart began to race, sweat beading on my forehead. "No," I whispered. "No, it can't be. Not here." I blinked hard, willing the shape to disappear. When I looked again, it was gone. But the fear remained, coiling in my gut like a living thing. I spent the night huddled on my couch, all the lights in the house blazing, a kitchen knife clutched in my trembling hand. Every creak of the house settling, every rustle of leaves outside, sent a fresh wave of terror through me. I was trapped in a waking nightmare, unable to sleep, unable to relax, constantly on edge. As dawn broke, I realized with a sickening clarity that this was my new reality. The creature might be gone, might never have been in my backyard at all, but the fear it had instilled in me was here to stay. I would never again feel completely safe, never be able to shake the feeling of being watched, being hunted. I stumbled to the bathroom, splashing cold water on my face in a futile attempt to clear my head. The man in the mirror was a stranger, wild-eyed, unshaven, with dark circles under his eyes that spoke of sleepless nights and unrelenting terror. "You're not crazy," I told my reflection, my voice hoarse and unconvincing. It was real. All of it was real. But even as I said the words, a small part of me wondered, what if they were right? What if it had all been a hallucination, a product of fear and isolation? The rational part of my brain knew how unlikely my story sounded, knew that Bigfoot was supposed to be a myth, not a flesh-and-blood monster. I shook my head, trying to dispel the doubts. No, I knew what I had experienced. The terror had been too real, the pain too vivid to be a figment of my imagination. The creature was out there, whether anyone believed me or not. As I made my way back to the living room, my gaze was drawn once again to the window. The morning sun illuminated my backyard, making the shadows of the night retreat. Everything looked normal, peaceful even. But I knew better now. I knew that behind that veil of normality lurked horrors beyond imagination. I sank onto the couch, suddenly feeling every bruise, every ache from my ordeal. The future stretched out before me, a daunting landscape of disbelief, paranoia, and lingering fear. How could I go back to my normal life after what I'd seen? How could I walk down a street, go to work, interact with people who had no idea of the danger that lurked in the wilderness just beyond the edges of civilization? As I sat there, grappling with the reality of my situation, a thought occurred to me. Maybe I couldn't make people believe me, but I could warn them. I could try to prevent others from experiencing the terror I had faced. With shaking hands, I reached for my laptop. I would write it all down. Every detail of my encounter, every moment of fear and pain. I would put my story out there, and even if most dismissed it as fiction or the ravings of a madman, maybe it would plant a seed of caution in someone's mind. Maybe it would save a life. As I began to type, pouring my horrifying experience onto the digital page, I couldn't shake the feeling that somewhere out there, in the deep, dark woods of Colorado, the creature was waiting. Waiting for its next victim, waiting for another chance to strike. And as the cursor blinked on the screen, the words flowed from my fingers. I thought I was alone in the woods until Bigfoot attacked me without warning. This is my story, my warning to the world. Believe it or not, but know this: the monsters are real and they're closer than you think.